Renee was coming home late. She had stayed at a friend's from university. They were working on a project together. Near her house, local hooligans hung out, drinking, cursing, and harassing passers-by. But Renee wasn't afraid. She worked past these guys. They knew her well and preferred not to mess with her anymore. The girl was proud she could stand up for herself, and she owed it to her grandmother. Though when Renee was still a little girl, she couldn't understand why her grandmother took her to martial arts classes instead of signing her up for traditional girls' activities. Renee started excelling, enjoying the feeling of being able to handle any boy in her group. Her grandmother explained it simply. I want you to be able to stand up for yourself. There's no one else to protect you. Your parents are gone. Only me. Yes, Renee only had her grandmother, who had been raising her since she was 10. She tried to give her granddaughter maximum attention. However, she couldn't cope with herself and her destructive habit, alcohol. The woman quietly drank in her room, trying to hide it from Renee. She drank, cried, then fell asleep. Something tormented the poor woman's soul, and the older Renee grew, the more she understood it. Alcohol began to kill her grandmother, and a year ago, the dreadful word sounded: cirrhosis. Renee cried then. She could lose the closest person to her. She begged her grandmother to stop, but the woman couldn't. Only now, she sometimes came out drunk, looking thoughtfully at her granddaughter and mumbling, I need to tell you, there's so much to tell. You must know. In those moments, her grandmother was already heavily intoxicated and postponed the conversation, hoping she still had time. Renee had wanted to have an honest conversation for a long time. She had more questions than answers. For example, why was she called Renee Walker when she knew her father was Larry Shaw? Renee remembered her dad well, even though he died in a car accident when she was barely 10. He was a caring and loving father. Renee remembered their huge house. It seemed to have 3 floors. The girl was happy there and jumped with impatience when she waited for her dad in the evenings. There was a nanny in that house, a cook in the kitchen, and some other staff. Renee didn't remember the people in the house well, but she remembered her dad distinctly. A big, strong man whom she ran to as soon as he came home. With a running start, the girl would jump on her father, wrapping her arms around his neck, and he would laugh, spinning her around the room. Fragments of memories swirled in Renee's head. There she was with her father at the beach, at the circus, at the zoo. Then everything came crashing down in an instant. Something happened, and the staff started avoiding Renee's gaze. Everyone around was acting distant, talking in whispers. Then her grandmother appeared, arriving from another city, packed up Renee's things, and took her away. At first, the woman didn't explain anything to her granddaughter, but Renee already understood from the broken phrases, from the tears wiped away in secret her dad was gone. They went to a foreign, distant, unfamiliar city. There, the woman bought a modest 2-room apartment and changed Renee's last name. She gave Renee her own maiden name, and she simply said to her granddaughter, "It's necessary. Get used to it." And Renee got used to it, without asking unnecessary questions. She was still young, but as she grew older, those questions started to arise. Renee tiptoed up the stairs and quietly entered the apartment. Grandma must be asleep, she thought. I hope she didn't drink today. Passing by her grandmother's room, she heard raspy breathing through the door. Alarmed, Renee rushed into the room and turned on the light. Her grandmother lay on the bed, blue-faced and struggling to breathe. The girl grabbed her phone and started dialing emergency services. Half an hour later, after the doctor's injection, which eased her grandmother's condition, she refused hospitalization. I don't need your hospital anymore. I already know my diagnosis. I won't go. I want to spend my final hours at home. Renee, see the doctor out. I'm feeling better now, she said. Tearful, Renee closed the front door and tried to compose herself. She wiped away her tears, lightly slapped her cheeks, and returned to her grandmother with a forced cheerful smile. "Why are you scaring me like this? Don't even talk like that. I still have a year left until graduation, and you have to support me at my graduation. Celebrate with me. It's a must. And then, you have to wait for great-grandchildren." "Wait, Renee," the woman interrupted, still struggling to breathe. "You can see for yourself. I won't be waiting for any great-grandchildren, and even graduation. And it seems I can't wait any longer. It's time for us to talk." The forced cheerfulness faded from Renee's face. She barely held back her tears, looking at the only reminder of her former grandmother. "Well, why are you looking at me like that? Don't worry. I didn't drink today. Come on, sit down. My story will be long." "Grandma, the ambulance hasn't even left yet. Maybe not now. Let's wait until you feel a bit better, and then we'll talk." "No, there's no more time to postpone it. I feel it." "Sit down," I said, the grandmother repeated firmly. Renee obediently sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't know where to start." The grandmother looked thoughtfully at the ceiling. "You remember your father, right? You probably do, even though we've never talked about it. You can't remember your mother. Of course, she died right after giving birth to you. My son, your father, raised you alone for 10 years. In the last years, he had a woman. But I'll tell you about that later. First, I'll answer your main question that's been tormenting you. Why you have a different last name. It's because your father didn't just die in a car accident. He was murdered. They killed him to take over his company. And I was afraid they might come after you. So I hurriedly took you away. I hid you from everyone. We came to this strange city, and I changed your last name so no one would know whose daughter you are." Grandma passed away quietly in her sleep just 2 weeks after that conversation. The funeral was modest, with few people attending. In this city, the woman didn't seek to make new acquaintances. After moving here, she devoted all her time to Renee. And in her free time, she quietly drank, sitting in the apartment. So, mostly Renee's friends attended the funeral. The biggest support for the girl, as always, was her close friend, Patrick. They had known each other since 6th grade when this new skinny boy stepped into the classroom. On the same day, the boys tried to push the new kid around, show him who was boss in school. But Renee stood up for him. Since then, Patrick followed Renee. And while at first she brushed off the skinny boy trying to act tough, by the end of school, there was no one closer to her than him, except for her grandmother. Of course, Patrick even went to university with Renee, just to be close to her. But contrary to what others might have thought, there was no romantic involvement between them. They were friends, best friends. Renee would tell Patrick about her guys, sharing her secrets, and he would talk about his girls. After the funeral, when everyone dispersed, Renee still stood by the freshly dug grave. She couldn't tear her gaze away from her grandmother's photo. She was young and so beautiful in it. Only Patrick remained by Renee's side. Realizing that his friend would stay there and not go anywhere, he gently hugged her shoulders. "Let's go, Renee. Let's go to your place. I'll stay over tonight. I don't want to leave you alone," he said. Renee obediently followed, resting her head on her friend's shoulder as he led her, gently embracing her, bringing Renee into her apartment. Patrick settled her on the couch, wrapped her legs in a blanket, and went to the kitchen to put on the kettle. While searching for tea, he came across a half-empty bottle of vodka left by her grandmother in the cabinet. After some hesitation, he grabbed it. Renee was taken aback when her friend handed her a full-shot glass of vodka. "What are you doing?" "I won't. You know it. It's what ruined my grandmother," she said. "Yeah, I know. But today it's okay. Come on, drink. It'll help you relax a bit. We won't get drunk," he insisted. Renee reluctantly drank the hated liquid, not tasting it. She handed the shot glass back to Patrick and said, "Get rid of this and pour the rest down the sink." After downing the shot, a wave of heat passed through Renee's body, and strangely enough, the pain did ease a bit. "Patrick, come here. Sit." She patted the couch next to her. "I want to tell you what I learned from my grandmother 2 weeks ago. Only with you can I share this. It's something that turned my life upside down." "Oh, I sense this conversation is going to be a long one," he replied. "As you know, we used to live in Boston." The girl began. "My father's name was Larry Shaw. Before marrying my mom, he founded a small construction materials company. He built it from scratch, taking on huge debts, taking risks. But the risk paid off. The company grew, becoming a large corporation. My mom didn't live to see it. She passed away earlier, when I was born. But my father didn't give up. He kept working, for the sake of his beloved daughter. As he told Grandma, she told me how much he loved me. I remembered myself. 5 years before his death, my father found a new love, a certain Lucille. But she was married, and to leave her husband, she persuaded my father to hire him at her company. Supposedly, so her husband could earn well, and she wouldn't feel so ashamed to leave him. Gradually, Lucille's husband gained my father's trust and became his right-hand man. And his wife didn't divorce him. She lived in 2 houses. And then my father got into an accident. He was driving at a crazy speed. There was almost no chance of survival. But oddly enough, he survived to wait for his mother, my grandmother, to arrive at the hospital. Before dying from his injuries, he managed to tell her that someone wanted to kill him. The brakes in the car were faulty. Only Charles Barnett could have done that, wanting to take over the company. Most likely, his wife Lucille was involved too. She called my father and urgently asked him to come out of town. Supposedly something happened to her. The woman pushed my dad, so he was speeding. My father asked Grandma to take me away, hide me from everyone, as he was worried about my safety. And Grandma fulfilled his last request, although as it turned out, I wasn't a real threat. There were papers signed by my father stating that in case of his death, the company would pass into the hands of his right-hand man, Charles Barnett. These papers couldn't be real because in the hospital, my dad told Grandma that all the inheritance would go to me, so I needed to be hidden as the heiress. But what happened, happened. Charles Barnett took over my father's company. Patrick shook his head skeptically. Sounds like a detective story. Don't be offended, but are you sure your grandma didn't make all this up? No, she didn't make it up. Grandma was completely sane. And besides, everything adds up. My childhood memories of my dad, the big house, the woman who used to stay with us at night. When Grandma told me, I remembered her too. She was very beautiful. No wonder my dad was so drawn to her. Patrick sighed sadly. He didn't like this story. Knowing Renee's personality, he understood that with this information, she wouldn't be able to forget it. Patrick asked, Renee, what are you going to do about this? For now, nothing. I still have a year to finish my studies. During this year, I'll learn everything I can about the Barnett family. And after graduation, I'm going to Boston. Patrick and Renee graduated from university. During her last year, all of Renee's thoughts were consumed by the Barnett family. Over this time, Renee learned a lot about this family. Their business was thriving, and the family lived lavishly. Although they preferred not to post their photos on yachts or their private plane on social media, their spoiled son did it for them. It turned out that the Barnett family had a son, 2 years older than Renee, who had recently turned 25. He was unmarried, handsome, and lived life to the fullest. He didn't hesitate to share photos of his vacations at sea or in his private plane. Renee felt a deep resentment as she looked at these photos. After all, everything the Barnetts now owned was earned by her father. But it wasn't just their material wealth that tormented Renee. It was the fact that they had committed a crime, deprived her loving father of life, and yet they were enjoying life and were happy. Throughout the last year, Patrick tried to dissuade his friend from going to Boston. What are you going to do there? Why do you need this? You won't get any closer to the Barnetts. And even if you could, what would you say to them? I don't know. I don't know yet, Renee said. But I know one thing. I won't have peace until I see them. Initially, Renee planned to go to the Barnetts and create a scene. But over time, she realized how foolish that would be. And then another solution matured in her mind. She wouldn't reveal her identity. Instead, she would try to get close to the Barnett family through their son, Edward. Apparently, he was very fond of girls and frequently changed them. And Renee was beautiful. She always had plenty of admirers. She had dated some of them, and there were serious relationships. But after her grandmother's death, Renee stopped being interested in boys. She knew that until she found peace within herself, she wouldn't be able to love anyone else. Summer. Renee and Patrick are sitting at the girl's house, discussing the future. So, have you given up on this trip? Patrick asked. It's final. I'm moving. Renee said. What do you mean, moving? I thought you were going there temporarily. You'd just take a look at these Barnetts and come back. Have your plans changed? Do you want to leave for good? Patrick inquired. I haven't decided that yet, maybe. After all, I was born there and lived there until I was 10. I want to meet Edward Barnett. Try to make him fall in love with me. And then we'll see. Renee said confidently. Well, really? Why do you need that spoiled guy? Can you flirt with the son of your enemies? Patrick asked. Yes, I can. Renee replied confidently. Patrick admired the determined girl. She could do it. He knew. Renee was so strong, both mentally and physically, despite her fragile appearance. But there was a flaw in her plan. Renee, are you sure you can charm Edward? Look at the photos. What kind of girls he has. They're all model-like. You're beautiful, of course, but somewhat plain compared to them. Patrick pointed out. I've seen their photos. They're all fake, while I'm real. Renee laughed. I just need to polish up. I'll visit some beauty salons. Then we'll see who's more beautiful. But, Renee, all this costs money. Where will you get it from? Patrick asked. I didn't tell you everything, Patrick. That night, my grandmother told me something else. It turns out, before she took me away, she cashed out one of my father's accounts. He instructed her to do so while he was alive. My grandmother managed to invest that money wisely. So, it turns out I'm not a poor bride after all. Renee revealed. What? Patrick exclaimed. So, we won't have any problems with accommodation in Boston. Who's we? Renee asked. We are. Patrick chuckled. You knew that if you went, I'd go with you. How could I leave you alone, prey to predators? I didn't know, but I hoped. How can you leave your new girlfriend? You're crazy about her. Girlfriend? Ha, there will be plenty more of them for me. But there's only one friend, you. When are we leaving? Boston greeted Renee and Patrick with rain. Staying at a modest hotel, Renee immediately began looking through rental ads. She was only interested in one area, located near the elite cottage community where the Barnetts lived. A few days later, Patrick was bored in the 2-room apartment that Renee had rented for them. She had gone to the beauty salon in the morning. Many hours passed, and Patrick patiently waited. Finally, the front door opened. When Renee entered the room, Patrick was stunned. Well, he exclaimed. Patrick approached the girl and hesitantly touched her hair. I never imagined such a transformation was possible. What did they do to your hair? He asked. Hands off. Renee playfully slapped his hand. So, what do you think of me now? Can I compete with Edward Barnett's girls? They don't hold a candle to you. You're right. You're better than them. Patrick replied. The gates of the elite cottage community swung open, and a silver sports car slowly emerged. The guy behind the wheel was momentarily distracted by the guard, but as he turned his head, he saw a girl walking towards him, engrossed in her phone. He quickly hit the brakes, realizing that a collision was inevitable. The impact was gentle since the car hadn't gained much speed. Nevertheless, the girl fell onto the asphalt. Edward, who was driving, froze in shock for a few seconds. Then he got out of the car and approached the injured girl. He wanted to say, "Didn't they teach you to look around?" But the words got stuck in his throat when he saw the girl sitting on the ground. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, I'm fine. I know it's my fault. I got distracted by my phone. I'm sorry," she replied. Following a premeditated plan, Renee intentionally remained on the ground, waiting for Edward to extend his hand. When he finally did, Renee got up. Edward was amazed. The figure of the girl he had accidentally hit was as beautiful as her face. Edward had had many girlfriends over his 25 years, both regular and models, but they were all the same template, while she was completely different. Not less beautiful than his previous girlfriends, but more natural. Renee rejoiced. Through his gaze, she could see that her plan of introduction had succeeded. Edward's eyes lit up. Now he wouldn't want to let go of the girl he liked so easily. "You've got dirt on you. Where are you heading like this?" "Let me give you a ride," he said. "Yes, I'm really dirty. What should I do now?" Renee asked. "I'll give you a ride. Let me take you and make up for my mistake." "Where were you going?" Edward insisted. "Now, probably home." Renee smiled. "I need to change, but I live nearby. You don't have to drive me." Renee pointed towards the apartment buildings located near the cottage community where the Barnetts lived. "No, I insist. I got you dirty, so I'll take you," Edward replied. Edward returned to his car and gallantly opened the door. With pretended hesitation, Renee got into the car. Not far away, Patrick breathed a sigh of relief, watching Renee's performance from the sidelines. He was not thrilled about the introduction plan and had been trying to dissuade Renee for a long time. "This won't work. What if something goes wrong? What if you get seriously hurt? We could arrange the meeting differently. We know the clubs Edward frequents. Let's plan your meeting there," Patrick suggested. "Meeting in clubs is too ordinary for him. He meets new people there all the time and might not even notice me. But this way, he'll feel a certain guilt towards me." "I've made up my mind," Renee replied, watching from the sidelines as the staged accident unfolded. Patrick was deeply concerned, only exhaling when Renee got into the car. The car headed towards their rented apartment, and Patrick ran after them. When he caught up, he found Renee sitting with her leg crossed and a self-satisfied expression on her face. In her hands, she held 2 glasses of champagne. She immediately handed one to Patrick. "Let's drink to my success," the girl said. "What success?" "So, he drove you home. What next?" Patrick asked. "The introduction went even better than I planned. Take the champagne. Tonight, there's something like a reception at the Barnett's house. A charity event. Turns out, our Lucille is involved in charity work. Can you imagine? Trying to cover up her sins, I suppose," Renee said. "Not necessarily," Patrick muttered. "It could be a mere money laundering scheme." "Did Edward invite you to his house right after your first meeting?" "Yes," exclaimed Renee. "It's unbelievable. Apparently, I made an impression on him. Initially, he tried to invite me to a club, but, as befits a modest intellectual beauty, I declined. And then he invited me to his mother's reception. Can you imagine?" "I don't understand why you are so excited," Patrick said. "You're not ready to step into that hornet's nest. How will you look the murderers of your father in the eye?" "With a smile," Renee replied. "With a smile and dignity. My legend and manners are rehearsed down to the smallest detail. I'll manage. Trust me." The next day at the Barnett mansion, Edward arrived with a glamorous girl in a beautiful evening dress. The evening proceeded as a buffet, with guests moving between rooms, chatting, nibbling on snacks, and drinking. Lucille Barnett approached her son, who didn't leave his new girlfriend's side for a moment. Something about this girl immediately caught Lucille's attention. Something elusive, vaguely familiar. This girl was nothing like her son's previous girlfriends, who didn't shine with intelligence even in their expressions. This one exuded intelligence and, for some reason, danger. The hostess herself didn't understand why she felt a sense of coldness and unease emanating from this girl, despite her smiling. "Will you introduce me to your new girlfriend?" Lucille asked, hugging her son lightly. "Mom, this is Renee. We just met her yesterday. I accidentally hit her with my car," Edward explained. "No, don't worry. It wasn't serious," the girl reassured Lucille with a charming smile. "Edward slightly bumped me with the hood, but it was my fault. I should pay more attention and less time on my phone." Indeed, Lucille hadn't been wrong. Judging by the way the girl spoke, she was very different from the silly models her son used to bring. Strangely, this didn't please her. Although she had previously urged her son to leave his airheaded girlfriends and find a worthy partner, and she was quite a worthy one. But there was something about this girl that deeply alarmed her. After exchanging a few more words, the woman walked away, hoping never to see this girl again next to her son. The evening unfolded in a warm atmosphere as guests mingled and drank. Renee was honored to be introduced to Charles Barnett and graciously accepted many compliments from him, all with the same smile. Only Patrick, waiting for her at home, could imagine what lay behind that smile. The raging storm of hatred that burst forth the moment Renee returned home. "I did it. I smiled at those people," Renee screamed, "to that woman and her power-hungry husband who live off my father's money, who killed him. I remembered them both. I remember how Lucille used to come to our house at night. And Charles, I remember him too, seen him with my father. How I hate them, for what they did to us. Dad believed in that woman and probably loved her. And she," Renee clasped her hands over her face, hiding her anger-flushed cheeks. Patrick interjected, "I knew it. Knew you wouldn't be able to keep your composure completely. It's too personal for you. Why did you go to that house? You met them, saw them, and then what? What can you do? You saw how wealthy they are, and that makes them untouchable to regular people. Let's go home. Let God punish them." "Home," Renee shouted. "Not for anything in the world. I know what I'm going to do next. I'll bewitch Edward so much that he'll propose to me. And I'll marry him. And then I'll tear apart this family's life from the inside." Edward's sports car raced through the night city. He loved to speed, often breaking the speed limit. And he also drove with one hand, the other holding the hand of his fiancée, Renee, seated in the passenger seat. There was a third person in the car, Patrick. He sat in the back and chatted incessantly. Renee had long introduced her friend to her fiancé. Patrick insisted on it, not wanting to remain in the shadows. It was unclear, but Patrick and Edward quickly found common ground. Sometimes, Edward himself suggested bringing Patrick along. Renee found this surprising. Initially, after meeting Edward, she paid little attention to his character. All her thoughts were focused solely on charming the guy, and she succeeded. Edward was smitten with Renee, and just 4 months after they met, he proposed to her. Only after that, relaxing a bit, did Renee begin to take a closer look at her future husband. The guy loved to party, make grand gestures, spend money, loved expensive cars. But despite all this, Renee didn't feel any negativity towards him, no matter how hard she tried. Why Edward and Patrick found common ground? Patrick couldn't answer that question himself. He just shrugged. "I don't know. I can't figure Edward out. When you talk to him, he seems like a pretty normal guy. If you ignore his wealthy antics, most likely, he's just pretending. wanting to look good in your eyes," Patrick remarked. Renee shared the same thoughts. Edward was his parents' son, and they seemed like fine, friendly people too. Charles Barnett was quite supportive of his son's upcoming wedding. He liked Renee. Why wouldn't he? She was smart, ambitious, beautiful. A suitable match for Edward. The fact that she wasn't as wealthy didn't matter. Even her lack of parents didn't bother Charles. She mentioned that her parents tragically died, and she didn't want to talk about it, claiming it was too painful. What did it matter? The main thing was that only beside this girl did Edward become more serious. He would take on the responsibilities at his father's firm with all due diligence. Lucille was furious when she learned that her son had proposed without their blessing. The fact that Renee had no family and didn't want to discuss her past didn't sit well with her future mother-in-law, and she constantly tried to emphasize this in front of her husband and son. They brushed her off, but a mother's heart couldn't be fooled. Lucille saw beyond Renee's happy smile a cold, assessing gaze. Sometimes, there seemed to be something malicious flickering in that gaze. Now, Lucille thought it would have been better if her son had married a typical pretty airhead, someone easy to manipulate. With Renee, it was the opposite. As if she were the one starting to manipulate her fiancé. Edward didn't share his mother's concerns. He was happy, head over heels in love with this unusual girl. Edward devoted all his free time to being with his beloved. Tonight, they were cruising through the city. The time was nearing 3 in the morning. Even Patrick, usually so talkative, fell silent and started yawning in the back seat. But Edward, despite his father waiting for him at work in the morning, didn't want to part with Renee. The speed-loving guy decided to take one last joyride. Suddenly, Edward slammed on the brakes. "What's this? Did you see that?" he exclaimed, looking at the frightened Renee. Patrick, who had just woken up in the back seat, leaned forward. "What's going on? Did you hit someone?" "He didn't hit anyone," Renee replied for Edward. "Edward, what's wrong? What did you see?" "There at the bus stop," Edward said. "There's a child, a little one, sitting all alone. It's night time, and there's no one around." "What is she doing there?" "You're imagining things," Patrick said. "It's time for us to sleep. You're not getting enough rest. That's why you're seeing things." "I'm not imagining it," Edward insisted, beginning to turn the car around. When they returned to the bus stop, they saw a little girl sitting on the bench. She had her head down low, crying. Surprised, Renee slowly got out of the car, following Edward, who had rushed over to the child. What surprised her now wasn't the presence of the child on the late-night street, but how her fiancé was behaving. As he knelt down in front of the girl, looked into her face, and gently asked, "Sweetheart, why are you here alone? Where are your parents?" The little girl sobbed, "I don't know. I got lost. My mom and I were leaving the store, and I saw a puppy, so I went to play with it. I played with it for a bit, and then I noticed my mom wasn't there. At first, I hid, and it got dark outside." The girl started crying again. For Renee, this night became a night of revelations. She watched in amazement as Edward took off his expensive jacket and wrapped the dirty girl in it. He carefully lifted her up and carried her to his car, wiping away the tears that flowed from her crying with his palm on the way. Renee stayed silent, observing how, as they drove to the police station, Edward and Patrick tried to calm the little girl down. At the police station, they found out that the child was already being searched for. Edward, upon hearing this, breathed a sigh of relief. He said goodbye to the girl and left his jacket on her. One of the police officers called after him, "Hey, kid, wait for her mom. Maybe she'll want to thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for. I didn't do anything special." When Edward drove Renee and Patrick home, the girl was silent. She was deeply shaken. Today's image of her fiancé didn't match the spoiled boy, the cruel son of cruel parents, that she had imagined. As soon as they said goodbye to Edward and entered the apartment where they still lived together, Patrick stared at Renee accusingly. "Did you see that? Who do you think you are to ruin someone's life? Why should this person pay for his parents' sins? He's not pretending. He turns out to be normal. You hear me? Normal. Money didn't corrupt him. And I don't want to hurt him. Patrick moved out. They had argued a bit because of Edward. After getting to know him better, Patrick tried to dissuade Renee from the upcoming wedding. Renee was adamant. She was determined to achieve her goal. Maybe Edward wasn't the person they had imagined him to be. But so what? His parents had ruined Renee's life, and she would do everything to hold them accountable, even if it meant Edward would suffer. Patrick moved out not because of the argument. Renee insisted on it. It was becoming difficult for her to hide from her future husband the fact that she and Patrick lived in the same apartment. Despite their friendship, Edward might find it strange. So, when he visited Renee, Patrick had to spend hours walking around, sometimes even sleeping on the streets. Not far away, in the same neighborhood, they found a small, one-bedroom, not too expensive apartment. Renee wanted to pay for it herself, but Patrick rejected her offer. After arriving in Boston, he almost immediately found a job. Patrick was good with computers. In his hometown, they called him a hacker. So, when he went for an interview at a prestigious company, they tested his skills and hired him as a programmer. I can pay for the apartment myself, Patrick said. Well, then do it. Who's against it? Can I come to visit you sometimes? Come sometimes, as long as I'm not busy, Patrick said, grabbing his things, which fit into one bag. Renee's first intimacy with Edward was easier than she had imagined. She thought she wouldn't be able to bring herself to do it, but she didn't feel any revulsion. Over time, she even began to enjoy being with Edward, no matter how hard she tried to turn against him. Sometimes, when they were together, Renee seemed to forget why she had started all this in the first place. It scared her, and she nurtured hatred within herself. However, this hatred flared up as soon as she had to cross the threshold of the Barnett's house. She was there often, trying to eavesdrop on Charles and his wife's conversations, learn about their habits, and delve into their affairs. When the conversation about the upcoming wedding arose in the house, Lucille demonstratively left the room, showing her disagreement with her entire demeanor. The first time she did this, Charles waved his hand after her and said, "Don't mind your wife. It's just motherly jealousy. She'll get over it and calm down." Charles liked Renee a lot. Renee decided to take advantage of it. She applied for a job in the Barnett office, citing that she couldn't sit idle. "Well, that's a very commendable desire," said Charles. "I respect that. We have a vacancy for a senior economist. Think you can handle it?" "I'll try," said Renee. "Thank you." Edward, although he didn't understand Renee's desire to work, was also happy. Now they would be in the same office building during the day and could see each other more often. A regular family business is forming. Lucille sneered. What bliss. But does it bother anyone that the girl appeared out of nowhere? Why does she stubbornly refuse to talk about her parents? About where she lived? Doesn't that bother you either? Maybe she's some kind of criminal. What do we know about her? Can't you see what manners she has? She has a higher education. Criminals don't behave like that. Besides, Renee is not poor, which also says something. Edward smirked. Open your eyes, son. She doesn't love you. She's going to marry you. That's enough, Mom. Enough. Edward jumped up. I've tolerated this for a long time, but I won't allow you to speak ill of my fiancée anymore. We love each other, and I will never give her up because of your suspicions. Okay, Lucille said, but let's at least hire a private detective and find out about her past. I told you, no. I won't stoop to such lows. I trust my fiancée completely. I know she has no skeletons in her closet. If you decide to do such a thing yourself, keep in mind, Mom will seriously fall out. Then, after the wedding, Renee and I won't stay in this house, as you insisted. Lucille calmed down, but only outwardly. She decided to wait for her son to calm down and then find out everything about Renee. But then something happened that threw the Barnett couple off balance and distracted Lucille from Renee. One evening, the whole family was sitting in the living room. Renee was there too. They were discussing where to celebrate the wedding when the homeowner's phone rang from an unknown number. Charles picked up the receiver and heard a hoarse, completely unfamiliar voice. "Hello, Charles. You won't recognize me by my voice, of course. After numerous surgeries, I've changed. Let me give you a hint. You're sitting in a house bought with my money. Everything around you is bought with my money. Your son drives a sports car bought with my money. Tomorrow morning, you'll go to the office of my company, which I founded, and which you acquired by deceit. You tried to kill me. So who am I? Say my name. Say it." From the shocked hands of Charles, the whiskey glass slipped and shattered on the floor. As if under a spell, the man uttered, "Larry Shaw." Lucille, sitting nearby, changed her expression upon hearing her husband utter this name, forbidden to be spoken or remembered. Charles, snapping out of it, yelled into the receiver, "Who are you? What nonsense are you spouting?" The hoarse voice chuckled, "You said it all correctly, Charles. Despite speaking and looking differently now, I am Larry Shaw. You thought you killed me and buried me, but you were mistaken. I survived. It took me a long time to recover, but now I'm going to reclaim everything you took from me. But how will you give me back the stolen years of my life?" Unable to bear another second of this voice, Charles pressed the disconnect button on the phone. He stormed out of the living room, ordering his wife to follow him into the office. Renee, with an unaffected look as she sipped her cocktail, glanced faintly surprised at Edward, as if not understanding what was happening. Underneath this nonchalant facade was jubilation. Renee burst into Patrick's apartment. "We did it," she exclaimed. "You called just in time and were very convincing." Charles dropped his glass out of fright. Great voice-changing software. Renee stormed into Patrick's small room, cluttered with computer equipment, and collapsed into the chair. "This is our first major victory," she said. Patrick was unusually serious. "Listen. Yeah, I get it. He was scared. And most importantly, his fear confirmed everything your grandmother said. You're not wrong. This guy is guilty. Now I'm sure of it too. But look, what he did to your dad is very serious. It's a serious crime. And now the Barnetts are scared, thinking someone found out about it. Of course, they won't immediately believe it was Larry Shaw himself who called them, and they'll be looking for who's threatening them. So there's nothing to celebrate here, because if they catch on to you, they'll try to send you after your dad, to the afterlife. And me, as a bonus. Patrick, don't dramatize, please. I understood all this before I even started the war against the Barnetts. But you don't have to get involved and help me. Go home. I won't be offended. I'll continue alone." "Oh, come on." Patrick waved his hand. "You know I won't do that. Tell me more details about how Charles reacted to my call." He was horrified. He ran to the office, calling his wife to follow him. They were there for a long time, talking loudly. I was with Edward. I hardly had a chance to eavesdrop. I only stepped out of the living room briefly, supposedly to the bathroom, and heard just a couple of words. Lucille was shouting, "This can't be." We were at the funeral. It was definitely him. "All right. Tell me what's next in your plan. How are we going to proceed?" Renee grabbed her purse and took out a small flash drive. "Here's the dirt on Barnett." Renee waved the flash drive in front of Patrick. "See what a champ I am. It wasn't for nothing that I got a job in his office. With the help of your password cracking program, I hacked into Charles's work computer during lunch break. Managed to download something that proves his shady dealings with purchasing substandard materials. Now you'll publish all this online, and then he'll get what he deserves. Of course, he'll probably squirm his way out of it, but it'll definitely rattle his nerves. Give it here." Patrick reached out his hand. But first, I want to make sure you're certain that if you do this from your computer, you won't get caught. Right? Because the Bonnet people will be looking to trace the leak. I'm confident in myself. They won't catch me, that's for sure. But what about you? You just started working at the company. And now this. Won't this raise suspicions? No, I don't think so. As soon as the information appears online, Barnett will receive another call, supposedly from my dad. That needs to be carefully planned out. Let's discuss it. The next morning, Charles Barnett's day started with alarming news. He received a call from the office informing him that there was an inspection underway. People from the prosecutor's office were present. They had evidence that he was engaged in malpractices. Charles grabbed his head in his hands. He knew he could probably hush it all up. He had the right connections among his acquaintances. He needed to immediately figure out where this leak came from, but he didn't need to investigate anything. Already in the car on his way to the office, Charles's phone rang from a hidden number. By the way, the first call couldn't be traced. His people tried, but the SIM card was registered to a deceased person. With slightly trembling hands, Charles answered the call. The familiar hoarse voice said, "Hello, Charles. I checked out what you've been doing with my company's affairs, so I had to pass this information on to the right people." "Not good. Charles, I ran my business honestly." "Who are you?" Charles shouted into the receiver. "I'll find you and destroy you. You already tried to destroy me once, and you failed. Now it's my turn." With that, the phone call ended. The unknown caller disconnected. In the evening, Charles returned home feeling drained. In the living room, his son and his fiancée were sitting. He had instructed his son in the morning not to show up at the office for now. He didn't want Edward to find out that things in their company weren't entirely honest. He tried to keep his son away from the schemes. Charles dashed into his office, instructing the maid to call his wife there. Renee, chatting with her fiancé, waited until Lucille joined her husband, and the door closed behind them. Then, as if remembering something, she began rummaging in her purse and exclaimed, "Oh, Edward, I think I left my phone in your car, and I'm expecting an important call. Could you please go get it?" Edward obediently went to the car, and seizing the moment, Renee hurried to the office door and began eavesdropping. "It can't be sure." Renee heard the voice of the homeowner. "Maybe we should ask this person some leading questions, answers to which only Larry would know." "What are you talking about? Are you starting to doubt?" Lucille asked. "You yourself just said it couldn't be Larry. If it really were him, all he had to do was show up and confirm his identity. Then he could have taken over our company by proving that his signatures were forged. Why would Larry go through all this if it were him?" Renee didn't get to hear the end of the conversation. Hearing Edward returning, she darted towards the kitchen, and when her fiancé started looking for her, she returned from there, saying she felt like having a drink. "It's boring sitting at home. How about we go for a ride?" Edward suggested. Reluctantly, Renee agreed, realizing that she wouldn't be able to eavesdrop on anything more anyway. As they drove out of the cottage community, Edward glanced towards the high-rise buildings where Renee and Patrick lived. "Should we take Patrick with us?" he asked her. "No, not today," Renee said. "Today I want to be alone with you." Renee did enjoy spending time with Edward, and she couldn't help it, no matter how hard she tried. But she refused to bring Patrick along for another reason: he was too busy at the moment. Patrick was preparing for the next step planned by Renee, and in this step, Edward would be involved. Charles was leaving his office when he was called by the guard sitting at the entrance. The guard handed the homeowner a tightly sealed envelope, saying that it was brought by some kid with instructions to deliver it directly to Charles. Charles carefully felt the envelope. It didn't seem dangerous. He could feel papers inside. So, he took the envelope and opened it when he got into his personal car and instructed the driver to head home. Several photographs fell out of the envelope. Cold sweat ran down Charles's back when he saw what was depicted in them and what they meant. These photographs showed his son sleeping on the bed with his fiancée Renee. The phone rang immediately. Charles already knew who was calling. "Well, Charles, did you receive my photos? What a lovely couple. And how sweetly they sleep. But they're so careless. Falling asleep like that. They might never wake up. Anything could happen. Like a gas leak in the apartment. Or like with me, the brakes failed. And that was it. What are you trying to achieve?" Charles screamed hysterically. "I don't know who you are, but my son has nothing to do with this. What do you want?" "Well, we've come to the main point. I want everything. Everything you own, Charles. It's all mine. I'll send you an account number. You'll transfer all your money there, sell all your real estate, and transfer that too. Don't try to be clever. I know all your assets. And of course, there's no need to sell my company. Once all the cash is with me, you'll transfer its ownership too. Well, that's for later." "Are you insane? I'll never do that. Do you think that sneaking into my son's fiancée's apartment, taking photos of them sleeping, and that's it? I'm at your mercy." "You're at my mercy, Charles. Ever since you messed with the brakes in my car, I had time to think about what happened. Your wife came to me at night, swearing her love. Now I understand. You knew about our affair all along, maybe even set her up against me. I'm giving you a chance to buy yourself off for now, with my money, mind you. But the desire to hurt you is too great, just as you hurt me. And to hurt you doesn't mean taking your life. It means taking the life of someone dear to you. I think that's your son. If money doesn't start coming into my account soon, you won't see him again." At that moment, Charles's son, Edward, and his fiancée were driving out of Boston in his car. Renee was in a good mood, feeling like going for a ride outside the city. She laughed, sticking her hands out the window. Loud music was blasting in the car, and Edward couldn't hear his phone ringing, which displayed Dad on the screen. Moreover, the sound on his phone had been turned down, something Renee had done meticulously, planning everything to the last detail. Edward and Renee drove far out of town and turned onto some country road. There were abandoned buildings that looked like hangars. Renee exclaimed, "I've never been to places like this. Let's drive up to those buildings and see what's inside." Edward agreed to anything his fiancée asked. He admired her cheerful demeanor. He liked her mood. When they pulled up to the abandoned hangars, Edward turned off the car. Renee pulled a bottle of water from her purse, pretended to take a sip, and then handed it to her fiancé. Edward took a few gulps. It wasn't even 5 minutes before her fiancé fell sound asleep, his head dropping onto the steering wheel. No wonder. After all, the water bottle contained a lethal dose of sedative. Pushing Edward from the wheel to the seat, Renee shook him, and once she was sure he was fast asleep, she pressed the car's horn. Patrick emerged from the abandoned building. Grumbling discontentedly, he settled into the back seat of the car. "How much longer do I have to wait? I've been sitting here for over 5 hours. Is he asleep?" Patrick asked. "He's asleep. Sound asleep," Renee replied, checking Edward's pulse on his wrist. Unintentionally, she felt worried about him. "Let's move him to the back seat and drive the car into the hangar, so it's not visible from the road. We need to stay here as long as possible. We'll periodically dose Edward with sedatives." "Are you sure it's safe for him?" "I don't like any of this. We're committing a crime," Patrick said. "And did you forget who we're committing it against?" Renee said. "Against the murderers of my father. The worst part is, I won't be able to prove anything. Do you think I need this money so badly? I'll take it only because it's my father's money. Let Barnett stay poor. But that's not where I plan to stop. I want to hurt them as much as possible. And now we'll see how much they love Edward, and what they're willing to do to save him." Lucille, swollen-eyed from crying, looked nothing like herself. She sat on a chair, clutching her hair on both sides, rocking back and forth. Her husband paced around with frightened eyes. There had been no news from their son for over a day. He disappeared with his fiancée. Their phones were turned off and most likely destroyed, as even specialists couldn't trace their location. How terrifying it was that despite all his money and connections, Charles couldn't influence what was happening to his son right now. And was he even alive? "What are you waiting for?" Lucille shouted. "We can't do anything anymore. Transfer the money to this account." "I'm transferring it. My guy is taking care of it right now. But this guy also demanded that I sell all the real estate. And that's not something that can be done quickly. Why isn't he calling?" Charles glared at the phone with hatred. Patrick looked at Renee and Edward sleeping in the car with great concern. He was afraid for both his friend and this guy whom he had only recently met. A day ago, Renee insisted that Patrick inject her with sedatives along with Edward. When they were found, they would surely have blood tests done to find out why they had been out of commission for almost 2 days. And based on these tests, Renee had to look like just as much of a victim as Edward. Patrick was against it, but Renee insisted. She said that if he didn't help her, she would inject herself. Patrick had to relent, although he tried to dissuade her. "That's it. Come on, you'll stop at this. Look." Patrick pointed his phone at Renee's face. "Charles has started transferring the money. With that kind of money, you can live in luxury for the rest of your life without a care. Take it and run. Let's leave Edward alone. He doesn't deserve this." "Run, you say? So that Barnett would figure everything out right now and make me their target. They will search. I'm not ready to stop yet. They took my father's money. So what? They are alive and well, and my father is gone. I don't understand. Do you want Barnett's family dead? Then your soul will be satisfied." "No, I don't want death. I don't know when I'll be satisfied. For now, I want them to suffer. If everything works out for us now, I'll continue to execute my plan and marry Edward." "But why? What is he guilty of in front of you? Maybe you already admit, at least to yourself, that you've fallen in love with Edward. So what's stopping you from being happy right now? Marry him, not because you wish on his parents, but genuinely. Leave Boston and be happy. Forget about his parents. Forget about the past." "That's enough," said Renee. "What nonsense are you talking? I didn't fall in love with Edward. Yes, maybe he turned out to be a decent guy, and I like him. I even feel sorry for him. He's not at fault in anything. But what was I guilty of? Losing my parents. So let's close this topic. Enough. Are you going to help me or not?" Patrick muttered something in response, but the girl didn't listen to him. She was handing the guy a syringe with a sedative. "Inject it." And so, Patrick sat in the car with 2 sleeping people. He kept an eye on the bank account on his phone. The amount in it was huge. Apparently, the Barnetts were genuinely afraid for their son's life and were willing to give up everything for it. But doesn't that mean they're not completely heartless? Although, on the other hand, would they have spared someone else's child? 2 days had passed since Edward disappeared. Charles was drunk. He had started drinking as soon as he transferred the last of the money. The man had done the impossible. His people had managed to sell almost all the real estate within a day, at rock-bottom prices. The Barnett family was left with only their house, well, and the company. Of course, 10 hours had passed since the last sum was transferred. And silence. No news, no calls. Drunk Charles lay on the sofa in the living room. His phone lay nearby, and he held a glass of whiskey in his hand. Lucille paced around the room. There were dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept for 2 days, not leaving her husband's side or his phone for a second. "This is it," murmured Charles. "Edward is gone. He's gone." "Stop saying that," Lucille moaned. "My son is alive. Whoever did this, they wouldn't dare. They wouldn't dare." "Dare what? Even if it's not Larry himself, he's acting on his behalf. And he knows everything we've done. Life for a life. You're to blame for everything. You tampered with Larry's brakes in the car. I wanted to do everything differently. And how did you want it then? Who came up with calling him and urging him to speed up? Me. Don't pretend to be innocent now. We came up with it together. You also conveniently forgot something, darling. Like how you asked Larry to take his little daughter with him that night. You didn't want to spare the child, remember? Larry didn't listen to you on that. Yes, it was late. The girl was asleep. That's what saved her life. Listening to her husband's drunken reminiscences, Lucille suddenly froze. Larry's daughter. Exactly. Why haven't we thought of her until now? She's grown up now. I remember. She's just a little younger than our Edward. What if it's her doing all this? The girl. That's absurd. How could she pull off such things? Besides, she can't know about the tampered brakes. No one could have known about that. Absurd, you say? Remember what his daughter's name was. Renee. Upon hearing this, Charles stood up and began rubbing his temples with his hands. Renee. Yes, Renee. What are you implying? Edward's fiancée has a different last name. It can't be her. She's not like that. Not like that. Do you know her? She appeared out of nowhere. And with her appearance in our family, troubles began pouring in. Behind her calm exterior, there could be a lot hidden. My goodness, why didn't I think of this earlier? Although she initially instilled in me a sense of dislike, Lucille's conjectures were interrupted by a phone call. Charles rushed to the receiver. A hoarse voice on the other end spoke somewhat mournfully, which was strange given the sums transferred to his account. Well, what can I say to you, Charles? You did a great job. You acted promptly. Well, as for my company, we'll deal with it later. My son. What about him? Said Charles. Yes, I understand your impatience. You're lucky. Your son is still alive. But it's really luck. I'll even explain to you how close he was to the edge. There was a bottle of my sedative in your son's car. I decided, as fate would have it, if he drinks it while driving, he'll repeat my fate. Fate decided to spare your son and his fiancée. Remember the place where you can find them. Edward looked on in horror at his unconscious fiancée, trying to shake her awake. Why isn't she waking up? I've been awake for a while now. He asked the doctor. For the 100th time, I'll tell you. The concentration of the sedative in her blood is higher than yours. We could wake her up, of course, but it's better for her to wake up naturally. Apparently, your girlfriend was injected with more sedative than you. Or later. The doctor replied. Neither the doctor nor Edward could know that this was all Renee's plan. She asked Patrick to give her an injection, intending to wake up later than Edward, to deflect suspicion. Unfortunately, this was not enough to dispel suspicion. The city where Renee grew up was already known to Charles. At this moment, 2 men hired by him were halfway there. Edward couldn't know this. He didn't leave Renee's bedside for a second, holding her hand, waiting for her to wake up. And when it finally happened, he was relieved. Hugging the bewildered girl, Edward marveled at himself. Just a year ago, he changed girlfriends every week. He could never have imagined loving someone so deeply. It was hard for him to imagine his life without Renee. All his plans, all his dreams, were tied to her. Where am I? What's happening? The girl asked. Edward, still not fully understanding the events of the past few days, began to tell his fiancée what his parents had told him. He explained that there was sedative in the water bottle, deliberately spiked, and then they were injected for another 2 days. It was done by a criminal who blackmailed their parents into transferring all their money to him. Edward also mentioned that there was security outside their room door, arranged by his father, who would take them to the Barnett mansion as soon as Renee fully regained consciousness. And the police? Did your parents report to the police? What did they say? Renee asked. No. Edward furrowed his brow. I find it strange myself, but my parents refused to report to the police. Their reasons are not entirely clear to me. But they probably want to find the culprit themselves. And if they find him, what will they do with him? Renee inquired. Well, then they'll probably hand him over to the police. Edward replied confidently. Renee wanted to convey to her fiancé that his parents were not as good as he thought. But Edward just smiled. Well, of course, I'm sure. What else could they do? They won't kill him. After all, Edward and his fiancée stayed in the hospital until evening. They underwent all possible analyses and tests. Lucille stayed with her son the whole time. However, in the evening, a phone call forced her to leave for an urgent matter. Before leaving, she instructed the guards not to leave the room for a second. When the doctor said that both Edward and his fiancée were perfectly fine, the security took them home. Along the way, Renee was alarmed that they were not allowed to return to her apartment. They were told they had to go to the Barnett mansion. Edward assured her that his parents were doing this for their safety. Renee's alarm grew. Guards were everywhere, and something told her that even if she insisted, they wouldn't let her out of this house. But what troubled her the most was how Lucille and Charles treated her. The usually friendly man avoided talking to her altogether. Lucille, on the other hand, couldn't contain her hostility. Her voice and gaze carried malice. Edward wasn't surprised. He knew his mother had always been biased against his fiancée. He saw nothing strange in the behavior of the guards or his parents. Renee realized that the Barnetts suspected her, and if they started digging into her past, it would only be a matter of time before their suspicions were confirmed. She wasn't afraid of what they would do to her when they found out the truth. What scared her was how Edward would react to it. Knowing what she had done, he would never look at her with the same love. He would likely even hate her. But why did she care about this now, when her life was in danger? What was happening to her? Could it be that Patrick was right, and she was actually in love? But he's a good person. If he found out the truth about his parents, how would he react? From Lucille's glances, Renee understood that her deception would soon be exposed. And she decided to do something she didn't expect from herself: tell Edward the truth. Part of the truth. The part that benefited her. Renee chose the moment when they were alone in his room. She closed the door tightly and spoke softly. Edward, I've learned something. I've learned why they kept you and me in that Hannah. Don't ask me how I found out. The important thing is that it's true. Listen to me without interrupting. 12 years ago, your father and mother had nothing. I think you remember that. And the company belonged to another man, Larry Shaw. Your mother slept with this man, and your father went to work for him. They betrayed him and killed him by tampering with the brakes in his car. And they illegally took over his company by forging signatures. Everything you owned was gained through murder. And now, as it turns out, either this Larry Shaw survived, or someone from his family is trying to reclaim what was stolen. That's why your parents aren't going to the police. Renee, what nonsense is this? Who could have told you such things? It's all rubbish. My parents are ordinary people, not criminals. How could such an idea even come into your head? Who came up with all this? Just wait. Just for a few seconds. Consider the possibility that it might be true. How would you react then if I were to entertain the idea that it's true? But I don't entertain it. Okay, what would I do? I would distance myself from them and leave, never to see them again. And I wouldn't take a penny of their bloody money. I'd start over from scratch. The lack of money doesn't scare me. Believe me, what's much scarier is actually being the son of such parents. But I don't believe in it. I can't believe it. Renee sighed once more. She hadn't misjudged Edward. He was exactly as she thought. And yes, she was ready to admit it to herself now. She loved this man. Patrick was right. Perhaps she should have stopped earlier. Renee sensed that something was happening. From the second floor of the mansion, she saw two unfamiliar men entering Charles's office. One of them was carrying a folder. Lucille also entered. Charles already knew. They had dug up something interesting. Without saying a word, One of the men laid the folder with papers in front of Charles. With some nervousness, he took out the sheets. It was enough to glance at them briefly to see everything fall into place. Larry Shaw's mother, arriving in an unfamiliar city, reclaimed her maiden name, under which no one knew her. She also changed her granddaughter's name to this surname. So Renee Shaw became Renee Walker, and she lived under this name in that city. But now she had come to Boston. Lucille stood next to Charles's desk, not waiting for her husband to fully familiarize himself with the information. She snatched the sheets from him and began to read them. The spouses exchanged glances but remained silent, unwilling to discuss it in front of strangers. Charles took out a sum of money from the desk drawer and handed it to one of the men. After that, they promptly left. Lucille triumphantly said, "I told you so. I always felt that there was something off about this girl from the very beginning. But you didn't listen to me." But how did she pull all this off? Abducting Edward. It's just unreal for such a fragile girl. She wasn't alone. She has accomplices. We need to find them. But right now, we need to do something about Renee herself. She senses that we've figured out who she is. I can see it in her eyes. We can't let her escape. We need to get her out of our house immediately. Where to? Charles asked. These things are prepared in advance. I've prepared for it. While you hesitated and waited for the results, I found a small abandoned building outside the city. Most importantly, it has dark basements. We'll take this girl there. I found the owner of the building and rented it for a month. No one will go there for a month. We can easily keep Renee there until she returns our money. And then, Lucille hesitated. Yes, what do we do with her afterwards? Charles asked. You know exactly, and there's no need to make me say it aloud. This girl is our enemy. She'll never stop. Better tell me, how many people from your security detail will we use? Just one will suffice. She's just a weak girl. But the person needs to be loyal, and I know who to choose. It's George. Lucille understood who her husband was talking about. George, who appeared strong but slow-witted, had always been loyal. Once, Charles helped put away the man who had wronged George's sister for a long time. Since then, the big guy was ready to carry out Charles's dirtiest tasks, and one could be sure that he would keep quiet. Renee sat in the living room, choosing a spot where she could see the door to the office. She watched as two men emerged from the office. Charles and his wife remained there for a while longer. Lucille was the first to leave, and from her glance, everything became clear. Barnett knew who she was. Renee's heart clenched with fear. She had to leave, right now. Patrick flashed through the girl's mind. What if they had already figured him out too? Renee was much more afraid for her friend than for herself. If Charles and Lucille harmed him, she would never forgive herself. Renee headed down the corridor of the first floor. She saw that nobody was paying attention to her. So, she slipped into one of the guest rooms and called Patrick. He answered with a worried voice. Patrick, they've found us. Run. Leave the apartment immediately and hide. Now it was time to try to save herself. The window. Yes, she had to climb out of the window right away and run to the far end of the yard. Renee tried to push the window open. It wouldn't budge. She didn't hear the door behind her, quietly creaking open. Silently, one of the guards entered the room. At the last moment, Renee finally heard a rustle behind her, but it was too late. The light dimmed in her eyes, and she collapsed to the floor. Edward, working on his laptop in his room, was completely engrossed in his new project. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and stretched. Renee wasn't in the room, and he realized he hadn't seen her for several hours. Deciding to find his fiancée, Edward left the room and went downstairs. Something in the house seemed odd to him, but at first, he didn't understand what it was. When he did, he was greatly surprised. There was no security in the house at all. Renee was nowhere to be seen either. When he couldn't find her, he called her mobile. The phone was switched off. His father's office was also empty. Worried, Edward rushed to the exit of the house when Lucille entered from the street. "Mom, what's going on? Where are all the guards?" he asked. "We no longer need security. The criminal has been apprehended," Lucille replied. "How? So quickly? And who is he?" Edward asked. "I hardly know anything," the woman said. "It doesn't interest me much. The main thing is that we're safe now." "You're safe? Talk to your father. Let him explain everything to you." "And where's Renee?" "What do you mean? Where?" Lucille shrugged. "When security was no longer needed, she went back home. She asked me to tell you that. Didn't want to distract you from your work." "I don't understand anything," Edward muttered. "How could she leave without saying anything to me? And you and Dad, you found the criminal, and I'm sitting in my room, knowing nothing. It's all so strange. I hope you turned the culprit over to the police." "Does it matter to you? Police or not, we've neutralized a dangerous person." "What do you mean neutralized? Are you the judge now? What did Dad do with him?" "I don't like this situation at all." Edward raced through Boston in his sports car. The ambiguity of the situation was driving him crazy. He went to Renee's home, but she wasn't there. There were signs of a break-in at her apartment. Clearly, someone had been searching for something. Edward tried calling Patrick, but his phone went unanswered. He rushed to Patrick's house. He wasn't there either. His parents couldn't provide any answers about his fiancée's disappearance. Lucille shrugged, and Charles was nowhere to be found. When Edward finally caught him, his father almost yelled, "What do you want from us? How are we supposed to know where your Renee is?" When the need for security ceased, she immediately went back home. "Can't find her. Have you considered that she might have left you? She's just a weak girl, scared by recent events, and decided to break up with you. What's so hard to understand?" "But why? No, Renee wouldn't do that. She would have told me. That's first. And second, who searched her apartment? It's obvious something was being looked for. Don't you believe me? Come on, let's go check it out ourselves." "Maybe she was in a hurry to leave. Deal with your Renee yourself. I have more important matters to attend to," Edward exclaimed. "Oh, by the way, you caught the criminal. But where is he now? Did you turn him over to the police or what?" As usual, Charles decided to lie. "Yes, I turned him over to the police. Just to our people. They'll handle it quietly. I don't need any fuss. It could harm the business. The guy who abducted you will be put away for a long time, but quietly. And I suggest you forget about it, like a bad dream." For the first time, Edward clearly saw that his father was lying. He had previously harbored fleeting doubts about some of Charles's words and actions, but they had been passing doubts. However, the story of Larry Shaw planted uncertainty about his parents in Edward's mind. He began to question, to look at their actions and words from a different perspective. Before, Edward hadn't thought about it. He decided he wouldn't turn a blind eye to anything anymore and would uncover the truth about this Larry Shaw story. But that would come later. Right now, Renee was paramount. Where was she? And where was Patrick? Meanwhile, Patrick was also in despair. Right after Renee's call, he left his apartment. Renee's phone remained silent, and Patrick simply paced around Renee's house, hoping she would show up. But she didn't. A familiar car pulled into the yard. Charles's car. Instead of him, a burly thug with a stupid expression got out and confidently entered Renee's building. Sometime later, when the thug descended and the car left, Patrick fearfully made his way up to Renee's floor. Her apartment door was half open, and even through the small crack, he could see the mess inside. Patrick immediately understood everything. Renee was in Barnett's hands, and they were now looking for her accomplices and access to the account with the money. What could they do to Renee to get their money back? Patrick pondered what to do next. He needed to go to the police and confess everything. confess to his own crime, Edward's abduction. Patrick was ready for it, as long as it meant rescuing Renee. Almost making up his mind, he hesitated. The police. The police would call Charles Barnett first thing. And he was a very wealthy man. What if he bribed them? Or what if he had his people in the police force? Then, to cover up the traces of the crime, Charles would have to get rid of the girl quickly. What to do? One could try to free Renee himself. But how to find out where Charles was keeping her? Edward also considered going to the police to report his fiancée's disappearance. He was on his way there when Patrick called him from an unknown number, asking for a meeting without explaining anything. Patrick arranged to meet on the outskirts of Boston at a small cafe. Edward entered the cafe and, seeing Patrick, rushed to him. "What's going on? Where's Renee?" The young man shouted. "Sit down. This will be a long conversation," Patrick said. Edward sat at the table and tried to compose himself. "What I'm about to tell you will be a heavy shock for you. Your parents are not who you think they are. They took over Larry Shaw's company by killing him." Patrick began. "Yes, I've heard this story," Edward said. "Renee told me, but I don't believe it. She said either Larry himself survived or his relatives organized our abduction to reclaim their money." "That's it," Patrick said. "Renee told you all of this, and you don't believe it. But you should. This story is true, as well as the fact that your parents killed him." But Renee lied a little further. This Larry had a little daughter. Her grandmother hid the girl, took her to another city, changed her surname, leaving only her real name. The girl's name was Renee. "Renee?" Edward asked. "Are you saying my Renee is the daughter of that Larry Shaw?" For a couple of minutes, Edward fell silent, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "So, you're saying my Renee is his daughter? She comes to Boston and meets me. What are the chances that my parents would turn out to be the exact people whose families suffered? Or was it not a coincidence? Did Renee intentionally get close to me?" "Yes, Renee planned everything in advance. She got close to you to enter your family. There was no abduction. We simulated it with her. Renee wanted to get her father's money back and hurt your parents in the process." Edward's life collapsed like a house of cards. His parents turned out to be ruthless criminals, and the only girl he genuinely loved had used him. He was only needed by her as a means to achieve her goal. Renee regained consciousness in the dark basement. A rusty door, a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, there was nothing more. Her last memory was trying to open the window in the guest room. She concluded that she must have been knocked out at that moment. Judging by the throbbing at the back of her head, she had been hit. Barnett had identified who she was and locked her in this basement with a specific purpose. They needed to get their money back. What would they do to her for that? Torture her. Renee knew one thing: as soon as they gained access to the account, she would become a nuisance to them. Most likely, she wouldn't leave this basement alive. So, she had to hold on as long as possible. Only that could give her a chance of survival. But what chance? Who could help her? Patrick. Unlikely. He probably wouldn't even have time to hide himself now. He might try to find her, but it was unrealistic. Edward could have helped, but he most likely would never find out where his fiancée disappeared to. Now Renee regretted not telling him the whole truth. What stopped her? The fear of seeing disdain in Edward's eyes instead of love. After all, he was a smart guy. He would have understood everything. How she used him to get close to his parents. And after that, Edward would never believe that Renee truly loved him. It seemed like Renee had been sitting in the basement for several hours before footsteps and the creak of the opening lock were heard behind the iron door. In the semi-darkness of the basement, Charles and Lucille stepped in first. Finally, the guard stepped in last. Victory gleamed on Lucille's face. "Well, Renee Shaw, your performance is over. What were you even hoping for? I don't understand. How stupid must one be to get involved with us?" Lucille sneered. "Get involved with you? And who are you? Who were you? A doormat for my father to pity. And him? Renee nodded at Charles. A pathetic lackey, renting out his wife to a wealthy man. My father was generous and didn't see the monsters around him. Enraged, Lucille took a step towards the girl and slapped her, but Renee instantly knocked her to the dirty floor. Charles snapped out of it and lunged at Renee with his arm extended for a strike, but his arm ended up pinned behind his back, and he fell beside his wife, face down. Only then did the guard regain his senses and threw himself at Renee with all his weight. However, even he couldn't handle the girl who had several titles in martial arts under her belt. Only together with Charles could they subdue Renee and throw her into the corner of the basement. Barnett was shaken by the sight of Renee sitting on the floor, licking the bleeding wound on her lip and still smiling. Charles said with fury, "You're just a rabid creature. And how skillfully you pretended to be an indifferent smartass. You've started all this in vain. You're certainly smart and understand what is required of you now. You need access to the account," Renee said with a smile. "But you won't get it. You can do whatever you want with me. Those funds are not yours. You can say goodbye to them forever." "You're mistaken," Lucille said. "We'll get the money back. You'll bring them to us yourself. You'll just sit here without food and water, and without light." Charles smirked. "This light bulb will go out as soon as we leave the room. Let's see how long you'll last." Barnett and the guard walked out the door. The dim light bulb went out immediately. Renee found herself in complete darkness. What would happen next? After talking to Patrick, Edward wanted to go to his parents, to shout at them, demand the truth. He wanted to see in their eyes that it was all a lie. They're not like that. But Patrick tried to persuade him not to. "If you tell your parents everything now, you'll endanger Renee. She's in your father's hands. Can't you understand that?" Finally, Renee. Edward didn't want to think about her. Her betrayal hit him harder than the truth about his parents. Learning that their relationship was just a game for her was unbearable. "Maybe Renee deserves what's happening to her now. She and my parents, they deserve each other," Edward said despairingly. "Stop. Right now, anger and resentment are speaking through you. When you come to understand everything, you might even comprehend Renee. She lived without parents, and all she had left of them were fond memories of her father. Before her death, her grandmother told Renee that her father was betrayed and murdered. After such information, she couldn't just stand by, living as if nothing happened. But she didn't plan to kill your parents. She just wanted to hurt them and reclaim what was hers. If there was a chance to probe the truth and make them answer for their crime, Renee would have done it. But there's nothing to prove now, so she did what she did." "She didn't plan to kill my parents," Edward said. "But she killed me, emotionally killed me. I was just disposable material to her. But I loved her deeply." "Wait," Patrick said. "Renee loves you. It's true. She was very worried about hurting you but couldn't turn away from the plan. At first, Renee saw you only as a spoiled boy. But over time, getting to know you, she fell in love." "What are you saying? And you think I'll believe that now? I understand you're saying this just so I can save your friend. You don't have to try. I'll do everything in my power anyway. But after this, I don't want to know or see Renee anymore. You say I can't reveal everything to my parents now. Okay, I won't. I'll talk to them later. But what do we do now? Where do we start?" "Think about where Charles could be keeping the girl. Maybe your family has storage spaces where there are no people. And if you can't remember anything, the only option left is to track your father." Edward and Patrick rented an inconspicuous car to avoid drawing attention and drove to the cottage community. Edward left the car in the parking lot with Patrick, telling him to wait. Charles was not at home, but Lucille was in her room. Edward went to his father's study and searched through all the drawers of the desk. Then he checked the laptop for their real estate. As it turned out, almost all of it had been recently sold, and Edward knew why. There were a couple of warehouses belonging to the company, but each of them had about 50 people working there. Edward felt desperate. The last option was to wait for his father and follow him. Edward went to the living room on the ground floor and sat on the couch. Deciding to wait for his father there, he grabbed his head in his hands. Strangely, he was deeply worried about Renee. Her betrayal hurt him, but his love hadn't faded. Edward couldn't forgive her, and Renee herself. These relationships had run their course for her. Now she didn't need him. Sitting on the couch in the living room, Edward was going crazy with thoughts when his eyes fell on his mother's purse lying nearby. Edward decided to dig into Lucille's bag. He immediately came across a piece of paper. When he unfolded it and read it, his heart skipped a beat with joy. This piece of paper was a lease agreement for a production facility outside the city. When Edward returned to the car to Patrick, he immediately understood. It worked. Edward found out the address. When they arrived at the correct address and saw Charles's car near the abandoned brick building, they parked their car nearby. The guys moved to the back seat and began to observe. 10 minutes later, Edward's father came out of the building, followed by his bodyguard, George. Charles said something to the guard and then got behind the wheel of his car. George returned to the building, closing the door tightly behind him. Security guard George was sitting on an old couch in one of the rooms of the abandoned building when there was an insistent knock on the door. He was surprised, thinking it might be the owner returning. Hastily, he rushed to open the door. When George opened the door, Edward confidently entered the building. Without giving the guard a moment to hesitate, he said, "Where is she? Lead me to her quickly. I have a couple of questions." "Who is she?" "I don't understand," said George, pretending not to know anything. "Enough. My father sent me. Do you seriously think I'm not aware of what's happening in my own family? Take me to her quickly. My father and I have an urgent question she needs to answer immediately." Edward spoke with such insistence, pressing George, who hesitantly started down the corridor. But before following the guard, Edward managed to open the entrance door, allowing Patrick to sneak into the building. George walked down the dark corridor, leading Edward, and inside him, doubt began to form that something was not right. Edward shouldn't know that Renee was locked up here. The owner often said that his son was not aware of his affairs. But it was too late to turn back. The man approached the rusty door, and Edward rushed forward to open it. George flicked the switch, illuminating the basement. Edward swung the door open abruptly and saw her. Renee was sitting on the floor, squinting from the light. One cheek of the girl was swollen, with a bruise on it, and there was a dried blood crust on her swollen lip. Hope gleamed in her eyes as soon as she saw her fiancé. Edward tried to act quickly, not giving George time to reconsider. "Get up," he told Renee. "You are coming with me." "To the guard," Edward said. "I'm taking her. My father ordered her to be moved to another location." But then George blocked the basement door and said, "The girl won't leave here without the owner's order. For now, I'll lock you both in here and call your father. I'll do as he says." Frozen in the corridor behind the door, Patrick, who was sneaking behind George and Edward, realized it was his turn to act. In his hands, Patrick gripped a broken piece of lumber. He had to knock out the guard now. George stood with his back to him, and the blow to the back of his head was quite strong. The guard didn't even stagger. With widened eyes, Patrick watched as the huge man turned toward him and prepared to strike. Then Renee intervened. She leaped into action and knocked George to the ground. She swiftly pushed Edward out of the room and dashed out herself. The heavy bolt on the door closed just in time. Immediately after, there was a push against the door. Shivering from the cold and excitement, Renee ran to Patrick and kissed him on the cheek. Then she took a step towards Edward, but her fiancé recoiled from her. Renee realized that what she had feared had happened. There was no longer love in Edward's eyes, and he only saved her because he was a decent person. But he would no longer treat Renee the same. Seeing the awkwardness between the pair, Patrick hurried them. Let's get out of here quickly. This brute will soon be calling his boss. Where should I take you? Asked Edward, settling behind the wheel. I rented a small room in one of the districts. Take us there. The girl couldn't warm up after the cold basement. Edward drove silently and tensely. Meanwhile, Patrick chatted incessantly, telling how they found Renee. He tried to lighten the mood. Renee timidly placed her hand on her fiancé's shoulder. Edward didn't jerk away or brush her hand off. Quietly, he said, "Remove your hand, Renee. There's no need for all of this. Will you ever be able to forgive me?" The girl asked. "Forgive you? What do I have to forgive you for? You didn't consider me. I was just a pawn to you. I respect you. You had to have determination to pull this off. And you almost did. You just had to disappear at the right moment after getting the money. But you decided to stay, to finish the job and get the company too. No, not because of that. I stayed because of you. I didn't want to leave you. Don't be hypocritical, Renee. Enough. I understand you. I understand why you acted this way. Why your anger towards your father's killers drove you. I'm very sorry that I became a pawn in your game, that I fell in love with you." The Barnett mansion greeted Edward with silence. Near the door of the office, Lucille paced with a grim expression. Edward immediately understood that his mother was waiting for him. That meant his parents knew everything. Edward approached his mother, who silently gestured towards the office door. Charles was sitting at the desk. Edward approached the table and defiantly looked at his father. "I don't know how you found out," Charles shouted, "but why did you let that girl go? What did she tell you? Do you know she drugged you with sleeping pills for 2 days? And for what purpose? To extort our money, which she succeeded in doing. There was no other criminal. It's all your Renee." "I know, Dad, but you forgot to tell me why she did it. She was reclaiming what was rightfully hers, wasn't she? It's her inheritance from her father, whom you killed." "What nonsense. Who told you all this? Whom do you trust more, us or that girl?" Lucille said. "Mom, don't lie," Edward replied. "I know the truth. It turns out I've been living a lie my whole life, surrounded by your pretense. You pretended to be normal, but who are you really? Monsters. Enough. Whatever we are, we're still your parents. And thanks to us, you lived in luxury, lavished money, drove expensive cars, vacationed abroad. Yes, maybe the money wasn't turned entirely honestly, but so what? We have it. And you should accept that and become a worthy son, not a naive fool who thinks you can live well without getting your hands dirty. Yes, son, sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. Do you even realize that by letting Renee go, you left us without money? Besides the company, we have nothing left. And to make it function properly and bring in the same income, we need investments. If we don't invest, there's a risk of bankruptcy. Do you understand that? We could become poor. Where is Renee hiding? Answer immediately. And what will you do, Dad? Extort money from her, and then kill her, like her father. Am I right? Yes, you're right. I'll do just that. So what? When you were splurging money, the moral aspect didn't bother you. From now on, you'll take an active part. You'll bring your girlfriend yourself. If you don't want to live in poverty, I'll live, as you put it, in poverty. Anyway, from now on, I don't need this money or the company obtained through murder. I disown you. I no longer have parents. If Renee had the opportunity to prove your crime, I would help her, not because I love her, but because I believe people should be held accountable for such actions. And here's something else. You no longer have a company. You'll transfer it to the rightful owner, Renee Shaw. You can start preparing the documents. And then what? What will happen? Charles said, looking at his son as if he were an enemy. If you don't do it, I'll go to the press. I'll tell the truth about you everywhere. And even if Renee and I have no evidence, People will believe me. By the way, we managed to film Renee being beaten in the basement. This video could be online tomorrow. I'm your son. I'll testify against you. And what will you do? Get rid of me. What are you doing? Son, have you gone mad? We're your parents. We raised you. We love you. This girl has driven you insane. You, no matter what, should always be on our side. Lucille sobbed. No, Mom. Edward replied. I can't hate you for what you've done, but I can't accept it either. Right now, you're like a stranger to me. A very cruel person. I no longer have parents. If you don't transfer the company to Renee, I'll do what I said. You can kill me. Charles looked at his wife, questioning what to do next. This boy was their only beloved son. They had tried all their lives to keep him away from their dirty dealings, and he had grown up this way. What could be done now? Edward hadn't been in touch with Patrick and Renee for a week already. The girl and her friends still lived in the same room. Although Patrick urged her to leave, she had regained her composure. But she couldn't leave here. After all, it was the only place where Edward could find her. They didn't even have phones now. Patrick was losing it. We need to get out of here. Why are we dragging this out? We don't know how things turned out with Barnett. Of course, they won't torture their own son, but they'll try to convince him. What if they succeed? It's been a week already, and he hasn't shown up. During this time, he could have changed his mind. Patrick ranted. No, stop it. Renee said. Edward couldn't change his mind. He will never do that. I'm sure of it. What a fool I was. Remember, you urged me to forget about your plans and to marry him for real. Why didn't I do that then? I got what I wanted, my father's fortune. But I don't need it. I love Edward. If I could turn back time, I could have turned a blind eye to his parents' crime, never seen them again. But forget it. I just wanted to be with Edward. And now, yes, I'm rich, but it won't bring me happiness. I met someone with whom I could have been happy. And I, blinded by hatred, didn't see it. What now? Neither Patrick nor Renee could know that Edward was standing in the corridor behind the slightly ajar door. In his hands was a folder with documents showing that his father's company now belonged to Renee Shaw. It wasn't easy for Edward to make his parents do this, but he succeeded. He had come here now to give Renee what rightfully belonged to her and to leave. To leave forever, from Renee, from his parents. To go far away and forget the past life, like a bad dream. It was hard for Edward to look Renee in the eyes. He couldn't rid his heart of love for her. But he couldn't live with someone who had used him either. Edward hesitated a bit, opening Patrick's room door, and heard the beginning of the conversation. He froze, wanting to listen to the end, and as a result heard Renee's confession. When the girl fell silent, Edward quietly closed the door and left. He dashed outside, inhaling the fresh air deeply. He needed to process what he had heard. Renee loves him. It's true. Spring was in the air outside. Renee enjoyed the weather, strolling through the park with her 2-year-old daughter, Linda. Glancing at her watch, she realized it was time to hurry home. Today was an important event for her and Edward. Their wedding anniversary, and she still needed to freshen up. Renee turned towards home and worked leisurely with Linda. 4 years. It's been exactly 4 years today since she and Edward got married. Renee remembered how Edward came to her with the company documents. To her words about her love for him, he simply replied, I believe you now. I love you too. Edward severed all ties with his parents. From Patrick, who was aware of all the rumors, Renee knew that Barnett had sold the mansion in the elite cottage settlement. And after that, they left Boston. From Edward, Renee knew that Lucille, at first, tried to contact her son. She called him until he changed his phone number. Then everything quieted down. And only after 6 months, after the terrible events, Renee and Edward were able to breathe out and get married. feeling truly free from the past. Renee didn't notice how she reached her home. The young woman and her daughter went up to their apartment. The apartment was huge, with 4 rooms, and the house was located in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Boston. This apartment was purchased with Renee's money. Her husband didn't object, but with one condition. They would live solely on his earnings. No longer wishing to have any connection with that company, the guy started his own business project, which brought in a decent income. Edward insisted on selling the company, but Renee showed stubbornness. Her father had built this company, and she didn't want to sell it. She appointed her best friend, Patrick, as the manager, who was doing quite well in that position. The company flourished. Patrick became important, dressed in expensive suits, drove a nice car. A year and a half ago, he married a beautiful and modest girl and was happy in marriage. Very soon the nanny should arrive, who will stay with her daughter Linda for the evening, as Renee and her husband planned to go to a restaurant. When the nanny arrived, the young woman went to the bedroom to put on her new evening dress. Renee was looking forward to this night out. Edward worked a lot, trying to support the family in comfort. He was only at home in the evenings, and outings together became increasingly rare. Renee put on her dress, applied makeup, and styled her hair. Edward was running late. Renee called her husband. Edward replied that he was stuck in traffic and would be there soon, but there was something strange in his voice, as if he had forgotten about their anniversary. The evening didn't start off well. Edward didn't pay attention to his wife's new dress, didn't comment on how it looked, which was unlike him. At the restaurant, Edward was lost in thought, not really listening to what Renee was saying. Dinner was a bit awkward and ended quickly. Returning home, Edward blamed a headache and went straight to bed. Though disappointed, Renee didn't say a word to her husband. Maybe he was in a bad mood. Maybe work was stressing him out. But he remained the same the next day and in all the days that followed. When Renee tried to talk to him, to find out the reason for his preoccupation, Edward evaded the answer. Then he started coming home late from work. Sometimes he returned well into the night, citing urgent matters at work. Something was going on. Renee felt it, but couldn't understand what. One day, Renee stopped by her husband's office. Several other people worked there with him, and she asked about the progress of their joint project. It turned out everything was going fine. So, it wasn't about work. Then what? Renee resisted the terrifying thought that plagued her. Her husband had someone else. It would have been a logical explanation for his recent behavior, but Renee couldn't bring herself to believe it. She loved her husband so much and believed in his boundless love. But if she entertained the thought of a rival, it would explain everything. As for the work delays, Renee now knew for sure that her husband was lying to her. Patrick was in a good mood as he drove to work when Renee called him. There was excitement in her voice. "Patrick, hey, can you come over now? I really need to talk to you." "Can't it wait? I'm on my way to work," Patrick said. "No, I can't wait any longer. If I don't talk to you now, I'll just go crazy. Please come." Arriving at Renee's apartment, Patrick first greeted his goddaughter with a kiss, then turned to Renee. "Is Edward not here yet? Is he at work?" Patrick asked. "Of course he's at work. I need to talk to you in his absence," Renee replied. "What happened?" Patrick inquired. "I think Edward has someone else," Renee confessed. "That just can't be." "Why do you think that?" Patrick exclaimed. "Well, he stopped talking to me, doesn't tell me about his day anymore, became very distant, and most importantly, Edward started staying out late, claiming he's working. But I found out he leaves work on time. He's lying to me." "So what? Maybe something happened to him. Maybe there are some troubles he's trying to sort out," Patrick suggested. "What troubles that he can't share with me? We've always dealt with everything together. Why would everything change now? And if it has changed, it means Edward has grown cold towards me and doesn't want to share his problems anymore." But he doesn't have any problems. Everything is fine with his business. There's only one explanation left. Patrick shook his head. He couldn't believe that Edward had found another woman. He knew how much Edward loved his wife. No, there was something else going on, and Renee was getting herself worked up over nothing. What do you plan to do? Patrick asked. If Edward has a girlfriend, I'd rather know about it right away. I want to know the truth. I didn't just call you to talk. I want you to keep an eye on my husband and find out where he goes in the evenings. Renee replied. Me? Exclaimed Patrick. I can't do that. Edward is my friend. Not as close as you, but still very close. I don't believe in your suspicions, and I'm not going to spy on my friend. Edward forgave us for some pretty serious things, and here you go again. You have a happy marriage. You love each other. So why are you so eager to ruin it all? It was a happy marriage. Until recently. And yes, I love my husband, but I'm not sure about him anymore. I'm not asking you to do the surveillance yourself. Hire a professional for the job. Please, do as I ask, and as soon as possible. I can't take it anymore. Realizing the desperation of his friend, Patrick reluctantly agreed. He went to one of the private detective agencies he found online. The young man working there, introducing himself as a private investigator, assured Patrick that he would handle everything professionally. Just 2 days later, the private detective called and arranged a meeting. Patrick went to the agency, and the young man laid out several photographs on the table. In the photos, Edward sat at a table in some small, poorly furnished room, and next to him sat a woman. Seeing her face, Patrick flinched. He gathered the photos, put them in an envelope, thanked the private detective for his work, and paid him. In the morning, Renee could barely wait for her friend. When Patrick arrived, she rushed to him. What did you find out? Come on, spill it. I can't wait any longer. She exclaimed. Yeah, your husband is meeting with a woman. Take a look. Patrick handed her an envelope with photos, and when Renee saw the faces in the photos, they slipped from her hands. Yes, Renee, your husband is meeting with a woman. But this woman is his mother. Mother, Renee muttered. The mother he rejected. The killer of my father. Edward betrayed me by meeting with her. Renee kicked one of the photos. Look at them. Sitting there, smiling at each other. So, they've renewed their relationship, and Edward has forgiven and forgotten everything. He goes to her in the evenings, barely talks to me. This is betrayal. Patrick, I'm going to his workplace right now. I'll throw these photos in his face. No, said Patrick. Don't you dare do that. There might be an explanation for his meetings with his mother, but if you show him the photos, it will only create more discord between you. Edward will realize you've been spying on him. Don't you understand you'll hurt him again with this? Are you ready to lose your husband? He might not forgive you for this surveillance. He won't forgive, exclaimed Renee. But how can I forgive him? You have to understand, him meeting with his mother is like a knife in the back. Lucille is my enemy, a lifelong enemy. Maybe he made up with his father. It doesn't seem like it. The private detective said there was no one else in the house, just Edward and Lucille. And where she lives, it's hardly a home. It's a run-down building on the outskirts of the city. Edward should never find out we were following him. I don't know if you're ready to lose your husband, but I'm not ready to lose my friend. First, try to have an honest conversation with him again. And if that doesn't work, come up with something. Like you accidentally found out about Lucille. Edward returned home late. Hearing the sound of the door opening, Renee stepped into the hallway. She folded her arms across her chest and stood, looking at her husband with such a gaze that he immediately understood. His wife knew everything. Renee asked, "Are you meeting with your mother? Is she in Boston right now? How did you find out?" Edward asked. "It doesn't matter how I found out, but I'm wondering, what's going on with you? I even thought you had someone else." How could you, Edward? Why, Renee? Please sit down. I can't sit down, the girl said. Speak. All right, said Edward. I'll tell you everything from the beginning. And you listen to me quietly. About a month ago, Mom returned to Boston. She found out where I work and tried to stalk me there. But I refused to talk to her. And I didn't tell you, not wanting to worry you. Every day, leaving the office, I ran into Mom, silently got into the car, and drove off, leaving her standing there. But then, something about her appearance alarmed me. Mom had lost a lot of weight, and she looked very unhealthy. One day, I finally agreed to talk to her. That's when I found out that Dad was no longer with us. He took his own life a few months ago. Dad was used to living lavishly, commanding people, and then suddenly such a sharp change in lifestyle. Complete destitution. The proceeds from selling the mansion were enough to buy a new, modest home in one of the provincial towns. The remnants were gone in a matter of months. Dad couldn't get used to economizing. Then hell began for him. He had to earn money for food to avoid starving. Dad couldn't start anything serious, so he had to take a job as a security guard. The salary there, well, for him, it was peanuts. Dad couldn't live like that. He started drinking. And then, a few months ago, Mom came home and found him hanging. I know what you're probably thinking, that he deserved such a fate. You're probably right. But Mom, after Dad's death, she found out she has cancer, and you felt sorry for her. Renee said. Sorry enough to meet with her almost every evening. Have you fully reconciled? I mean, you understand that your father deserves his fate. But what about Lucille? Yes, maybe she has cancer. These things happen to people. But maybe this is also her punishment for the past. Renee, I asked you to listen to me first, said Edward. Once, I agreed to go to her apartment with her. I was hoping to have a serious conversation with her and tell her not to show up to me anymore. But when I got there, I was horrified. You can't even imagine the conditions she's living in. Mom says it's all she can afford right now. That evening, we talked a lot, something we hadn't done since I found out about their crime. Mom cried and told me how it happened, how she betrayed your father. In reality, she didn't want to do it. Dad forced her to. Finding out about his wife's affair with Larry, he threatened her that she would never see her son again, meaning me, or she would do what he ordered her to do. So, Mom committed this crime for my sake. Understand? She didn't want to. Dad threatened her. Renee, hear me out. Mom is just as much a victim of my father as you are. He forced her into committing the crime, and she didn't want to. You believe that? Renee yelled. How can you believe that? She's lying to you. She's just as complicit as your father. They planned it all together. And what about me? How did they treat me? Have you forgotten that Lucille and Charles came to my basement and humiliated me even more than your husband did? Of course, now she's left alone, without support, and most importantly, without money. She needs you. I admit she loves you, but she also wants to take advantage of you. But that's not true. Edward exclaimed. Mom doesn't want to take money from me. I offered, believe me. My mother, no matter what, is sick. She doesn't take my money. The only thing she agreed to is for me to rent her a decent apartment, and you've already done that, Renee said. How could you? Behind my back. That's it, Renee. I'm doing what I think is necessary, and I won't abandon my sick mother. Why should I leave her? After all, she turned out to be just as much a victim as you. I'm going to bed now, and you'll think about everything calmly. I know you are kind and understanding, and you should understand me. We'll talk when we've cooled down. This was their first family scandal. And the cause of this scandal was Lucille. It was she, the hypocritical snake. Renee didn't believe her for a second. She didn't believe that in her father's murder, Lucille was a victim, not an accomplice. This is a lie. Renee admitted that Lucille might actually have cancer now, something you couldn't fake. Moreover, the woman came to her son to complain and extort money from him. Edward is a kind person and has always loved his mother. But now Lucille returned, all miserable, abandoned, and sick. She knew her son's weaknesses and how to press him right to make him rush to her aid. Renee stayed awake for a long time, unable to calm down. Maybe Edward is right. Maybe it's better to cool down first. And even better, to discuss the situation with a close friend who always gives good advice. With Patrick. When Patrick saw Renee in his office in the morning, he immediately understood from her face that she had spoken with her husband. We talked. Edward confessed everything. He's seeing his mother because she has cancer. And supposedly, it turns out she's not a criminal but a victim. I understood the gist of it all. Something like this I suspected. Edward is a smart and strong man. But at the same time, he's very kind. And this is his mother. You should understand too. After all, he forgave you in the past. He forgave. Even though not everyone would have been able to. You were very harsh on him. And now there's his mother, who raised him. If she were strong and independent, like before, maybe Edward wouldn't have communicated with her. But this illness, you better tell me, what are you planning to do? Yesterday I seriously thought about divorce. Renee said. What divorce? Divorce from the person you love, and who loves you. And why? Because he pitied his own mother. Do you hear yourself? Exclaimed Patrick. So what? What are you suggesting to me? Do you believe her? Do you believe in her innocence? No, I don't believe her. This woman is as cruel as her husband. But cancer is a very serious matter. And judging by the way Lucille's appearance has already been affected, she's in an advanced stage. So maybe you should just wait it out. Let the son spend time with his mother, either until her passing or until recovery. If Lucille can't overcome the illness, it will resolve itself. And if she recovers, then you can give ultimatums to your husband to send her away. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, in a dirty room, a content Lucille awaited her son. Yesterday evening he told her that he rented a nice apartment in the city center. And today, Edward decided not to go to work, but to come to his mother and move her. The woman scrutinized herself critically in the mirror. She applied dark circles under her eyes, giving herself a sickly look, then inspected her head with the regrown hair. She sighed heavily and reached for the razor. There were no flaws in her performance. Since she's supposed to have cancer and have undergone chemotherapy, she should look accordingly. After shaving her head, she wrapped it in a scruffy scarf. Lucille didn't look very tidy now, wearing old cheap clothes. In addition to that, there was a melancholic expression on her face, with eyes filled with pain. This was how she greeted her son. Lucille didn't have any cancer. Everything was meticulously planned. She had been on a severe diet, giving herself an unnatural thinness for 3 months. Charles did indeed take his own life. After her husband's death, Lucille felt like her life was over. There was no money, and now there was no husband from whom she could demand it. Lucille saw a photo on one of the social media pages, on Renee's profile. What a happy family. Laughing Edward holds a cheerful daughter in his arms. Lucille's granddaughter, by the way, whom the grandmother had never seen in person. By what right does this Renee enjoy life? She took everything away from them with her husband. And Edward. He looks happy next to his wife and daughter. But it shouldn't be like this. Edward, their son, cannot be happy next to this trash. It was at that moment, looking at the photo on her phone screen, that Lucille understood what she would do next. She would fight for her wealthy life, for her son, for her money. How she would do it, the woman didn't know yet. There was no plan at first. But first, she needed to go to Boston and regain her son's trust. Lucille was sure that if she pretended to be sick, Edward's heart would soften. Of course, Lucille's story about how she suffered at the hands of her husband, forcing her to betray Larry Shaw, was a lie. All their actions were planned together with her husband. And the idea to sabotage the breaks was Lucille's idea. But Edward didn't need to know about it. For several months, Lucille prepared to return to Boston. She barely ate anything and learned how to apply makeup to give her face a sickly appearance. She felt sorry for her hair. It used to be magnificent, but she ruthlessly cut it off. Lucille didn't have money, but she had a few precious jewels left from her past life. She hid them from her husband. Returning to Boston, she sold these jewels. She still had connections in the city. She knew which doctors she could turn to for money to obtain the necessary documents confirming her cancer diagnosis. Her legend had to be supported by documentary evidence. Edward, sentimental as he was, wasn't a fool. The final touch to complete the image of a sufferer was Lucille moving in this run-down apartment. And as disgusting as it was for her to be in that room, she endured it. She knew that if everything went well, her son wouldn't be able to bait and would rent her a proper apartment. And that's exactly what happened. Edward just called and told his mother to get ready. He was coming to take her to the new apartment. Lucille looked at herself in the mirror, and through the makeup creating a sickly appearance, her eyes sparkled with triumphant gleam. That's it, Renee. I made the first move, and it turned out to be successful. Now it will be hard for you to turn my son away from me. I know him too well. He won't be able to abandon his miserable mother. My next step will be to get acquainted with my granddaughter. Lucille genuinely wanted this. And then, what would be the logical conclusion of her triumphant victory? She hadn't fought it through yet, but she knew one thing. If something happened to Renee, an accident, for example, Edward would inherit both the money and the company. Everything would return to her hands because she knew how to manipulate her son. Renee returned home from the beauty salon, where she went to get her hair done. Edward, seeing his wife's new hairstyle, complimented her. Everything was almost back to normal. Almost, but not quite. There was always an invisible shadow of Lucille between husband and wife. Renee stopped opposing Edward's meetings with his mother. She decided to wait and see what Lucille would do next. And she set only one condition for her husband: that Lucille wouldn't touch their family. Let Edward meet her somewhere else. But at home, he wouldn't even mention his mother or try to reconcile them. It's been 2 months since Renee found out about Lucille's return. Edward calmed down. He no longer needed to hide anything from his wife. He was grateful to Renee for accepting the situation, and he became his old self. A loving, caring husband and father. A couple of times, he couldn't help but mention that his mother doesn't blame Renee at all. On the contrary, she feels guilty towards her. But Renee wasn't impressed. She knew too well how good Lucille was at pretending. So, Renee just waited for further actions from the cunning woman. Today, Edward had the day off, and without discussion, he sent his wife to get her hair done. He said he'd happily spend time with their daughter. Everything would have been fine if, by the evening, Linda hadn't uttered a new word for her. "Grandma, Grandma," the little girl said clearly. Renee was shocked. She squatted down in front of her daughter and asked, feeling Edward's frightened gaze behind her, "And who is this, Grandma? Did you see Grandma?" "Yes, Grandma came to visit us today, when Daddy and I were alone. She gave me a doll. Look, it's really beautiful, isn't it?" Renee stood up and turned to her husband. "How dare you?" she said. "You brought her into our home, allowed her near Linda. I don't understand why you're making such a tragedy out of this. So, Grandma met her granddaughter, but in your absence, just like you wanted. Mom isn't feeling well right now. Chemotherapy didn't give the expected results. She's afraid she won't make it, and she won't even get to meet her own granddaughter. Renee, do you have a heart? How can Mom harm Linda? You have no idea how happy she was to meet her granddaughter. She said she even felt better. I don't care how she feels. I accepted your meetings, even though it wasn't easy for me. But I won't let her near our daughter. Never again. Don't you dare. Do you hear me? Don't you dare. Why won't you let her? Are you the only parent? I'm Linda's father, and I have the right to decide too. Why are you so heartless? Mom is repenting. I don't believe in her repentance. Even if she does repent, one repentance is not enough to bring back my father, my happy childhood. And don't forget, if it weren't for you and Patrick, I wouldn't be here either. Thanks to your mother. So, spare me the talk about her repentance. She won't get anywhere near our daughter. Mark my words. Well, we'll see about that, Edward said. He left the room, and a few minutes later, Renee heard the front door of the apartment closing. That day, Edward didn't come home to spend the night. It had never happened before. In the morning, Renee wanted to call her husband, but she held herself back. He wasn't rushing to call either. Renee gathered her daughter and went for their daily work. They headed to the playground. Linda joyfully ran to the sandbox, seeing her friends there, and Renee waved to a red-haired girl. She also brought her son for a walk. Renee sat down on a bench. The boy's mother kept chatting non-stop. Renee remembered that she forgot to bring water for her daughter from home. Nearby, across the road, there was a supermarket. Renee decided to quickly run there to buy water. The red-haired girl agreed to keep an eye on Linda. Renee approached the road and stepped onto the pedestrian crossing. There were hardly any cars, and the girl didn't notice as a black, fully tinted car came flying around the corner. Without slowing down, it raced straight towards Renee. All this happened right in front of mothers and children walking in the playground. The red-haired girl jumped off the bench and covered her mouth with her hand, watching as Renee, flipping through the air and flying several meters, like a broken doll, fell onto the asphalt. In a cafe in downtown Boston sat a haughty woman. Nothing about this well-dressed figure betrayed the Lucille she had been just a few hours ago when meeting her son. She finished her second cup of coffee and tapped her fingers on the table. Lucille was starting to get nervous. She had been sitting in this cafe for 2 hours already, and George still hadn't shown up. Could something have gone wrong? Lucille had contacted George, her husband's former bodyguard, about a week ago, not finding a better candidate for what she had in mind. The man was very pleased to hear from Lucille, although he was disappointed that his employer was no longer alive. George was loyal to Charles, and now he was ready to extend that loyalty to his wife, for a fair fee, of course. When Lucille outlined her plan to him, George smirked. He himself despised Renee ever since he kept her in the basement, and she, knocking him off balance, slammed the door shut in front of him. So, there were no moral qualms for George about Lucille's assignment. Only the payment, and one more aspect needed to be discussed. Renee almost always works with her daughter. Rarely does she leave the house alone. This girl is my granddaughter. I don't want the child to get hurt. Choose a moment when the girl isn't with Renee. And what if it doesn't work out? If there isn't a moment like that, then what? Keep waiting. Or maybe, if the child gets a little hurt, it won't be so bad. If there's no other way, then fine, you can involve the girl. But try very hard to make sure the granddaughter stays alive. Understand? And finally, the huge man appeared in the cafe. He approached Lucille's table, and from the goofy smile on his face, she understood that everything had worked out. But something still bothered Lucille. Is everything okay with the granddaughter? Yeah. No need to worry. The girl stayed at the playground, and Renee went across the road. George paused, and his smile widened even more. Well, don't keep me waiting. Spill it. Renee, is she, judging by how she flipped in the air, there's little chance she survived that. And she fell dramatically. I watched from the rearview mirror. She lay there lifeless, quiet. Well done. I never doubted you. Here, take this. The woman pulled out an envelope of money from her purse. That's it for now. If I need you again, I'll call. Edward sat on a bench in the hospital, his head in his hands. Behind the doors of the operating room, Doctors were currently trying to save his wife. And at that moment, there was nothing more important to Edward. "Renee, my love, just live. Fight. Please fight. Survive. I can't live without you. Our daughter needs you. Don't leave her," muttered Edward. Edward didn't notice when Patrick burst into the hospital. "So, how is she? Is she alive?" asked Patrick. "She's alive. She's in surgery. The surgeon said her condition is very serious," replied Edward. "Well, did you get what you wanted? Is this what you had in mind when you started talking to your mother?" "I won't forgive you if Renee dies," said Patrick. "What are you talking about? What does my mother have to do with this? This was an accident. Probably a drunk driver. He fled the scene of the accident. Of course, he fled. How could he not flee if all of this was planned in advance? I also talked to the police. This car is reported stolen. If Renee had hit by random driver, even a drunk one, he would have been caught. But now I have no doubts. Your mother orchestrated this." Patrick grabbed his head with his hands. "Oh God, what a fool I am. I advised Renee to reconcile, for the sake of your love, to endure. I should have guessed that Lucille wouldn't stop. It all makes sense now. If Renee dies now, you'll be her direct heir, and your mommy knows how to manipulate you. Stop it right now. Don't you dare speak about my mother like that. She's sick, very sick, and she regrets what she's done. Not once have I heard a bad word from her about Renee. On the contrary, Mom feels guilty towards her." "I see. Your attachment to your mother has completely clouded your judgment. You're such a fool, ready to lose your wife but refuse to see the truth about your own mother." "I'm not ready. I can't lose Renee. I love her." The argument between the two men was interrupted by the surgeon who came out. He addressed Edward. "The operation was successful. We did everything in our power. Now, whether your wife survives depends only on God and her body. She's in the intensive care unit now. All we can do is wait. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Edward and Patrick stayed in the hospital for almost a day. They sat on the same bench but didn't speak to each other. Silently, they sat and waited. Finally, the doctor came out to them again. He approached the men with a smile and said they could breathe a sigh of relief. Renee was out of danger. She had regained consciousness and would survive. Of course, she would need extensive rehabilitation, and it was still uncertain whether she would be able to work. She would spend several days in the intensive care unit before being transferred to a regular ward. Only then could she receive visitors. Edward and Patrick breathed a collective sigh of relief and went home. Silently, without saying a word to each other, they left the hospital and went to their respective cars. Edward arrived home feeling drained. He called his mother, intending to share the news that Renee would survive. Lucille already knew about the accident. Edward had called her from the hospital. When Lucille heard that Renee had regained consciousness, she exclaimed joyfully, "Oh, thank God, son. I prayed for your wife. How wonderful. But wait, you said her recovery would be long. And Linda, who will take care of her all this time? You're working. So, who's with my granddaughter right now?" "Don't worry, Mom. She's with a nanny. We have a good nanny." "But why does she need a nanny when her grandmother is alive?" "Edward, can I come over? I'll stay with my granddaughter, and you can rest. And maybe while Renee is in the hospital, I can stay with you." Edward hesitated. He didn't want to offend his mom. But what if Renee finds out about this? And she will definitely find out. What then? Renee will be upset, angry. And won't it make her worse? Will she want to leave him because her husband ignored all her demands and let his mom see Linda? Finally, he sighed heavily and said, "No, Mom, not yet. Renee isn't ready for this yet. And I don't want to upset her. She's still weak. I'm sorry. Besides, you're not feeling well yourself. By the way, how are you feeling now?" "I'm fine, son. I'm holding on. Meeting my granddaughter gave me a new lease on life. I felt a surge of strength to keep fighting this terrible illness. Call me when you have news about Renee. Okay. When Lucille hung up the phone, her face twisted with anger. How is this possible? How did that wretch manage to survive? George said there was almost no chance. If Renee leaves the hospital now, attempting to harm her again is out of the question. It'll look too suspicious. So what do we do? There's only one way out. We have to make sure Renee doesn't leave the hospital. Even if she has regained consciousness, after such injuries, anything can happen. Complications can arise. Anything can happen. A few days later, Edward received a call from the hospital informing him that Renee had been transferred to a regular ward. He hurried to his wife. At the hospital, it turned out that Patrick had found out about Renee before her husband. The nurse on duty informed Edward that his wife's friend had already visited and paid for a private VIP room for her, which was located at the end of the corridor. Besides his wife, he found another man in the room whose expression revealed his affiliation with the security business. Renee smiled at her husband, though any movement seemed to cause her pain. Edward kissed her and turned to the man. Who are you? And why are you sitting here? I'm a security guard hired by Patrick. He believes that Renee needs round-the-clock protection. Leave. I want to talk to my wife alone. There was no such instruction. I only obey Patrick. Renee reached out to her husband. Edward, let him stay. This person doesn't bother me. Patrick feels calmer this way, so let it be. And do you know why Patrick hired him? He suspects that the accident involving you wasn't an accident, that it was orchestrated by my mother. I know, she whispered. And what? Do you also think so? Do you think my mother could do such a thing? I don't know, Renee replied. Let's not talk about this. Patrick, he always knows what he's doing. I trust him. Edward felt torn apart. His heart belonged to this girl lying before him on the bed. But his mother, she was his mother, and she was also ill. How to convince his wife that she wasn't capable of such things, that she had changed? Edward sat, choosing his words carefully, when the door to the ward cracked open behind him. Oh, sorry. I think I got the wrong room. As Edward was sitting with his back to the door, he didn't see who was speaking, but the voice seemed so familiar. When the guy realized whose voice it might be, Edward abruptly jumped from his chair and rushed out of the room. The man's back peeked into the room, standing halfway down the corridor. Edward wanted to catch up with him, but then the nurse at the station called out to the man, and he turned around. Edward recognized him. It was his father's former security guard, George. Edward didn't go back to his wife's room. He followed George, wanting to track him, but he couldn't. The man slipped out of his sight. Edward sat behind the wheel of his car. He didn't go home. He drove out of town, onto the highway, and he floored the gas pedal. The high speed calmed him now, drowning out the disappointment of a terrible suspicion. Could Patrick be right? Was it really his mother? George couldn't have accidentally peeked into the room. Such coincidences don't happen. Why did he come? Edward and Patrick sat side by side, staring at the laptop screen. It showed the rooms in Lucille's apartment. These were cameras installed there, filming in real time and transmitting the images to Patrick's laptop. And it was Patrick who installed these cameras in every room of Lucille's apartment. A few hours ago, Edward called his mother and asked her to come over, saying that Linda missed her grandmother. Lucille immediately came, unaware that there was a stranger in her apartment at that time. And that stranger was Patrick. Edward himself called him and agreed to check his theory about Lucille. Just to check. While Lucille was at her son's house, playing with her granddaughter, her phone rang several times. She ignored the calls. Edward noticed this, although previously it wouldn't have seemed suspicious to him. After Lucille left for her own apartment, Patrick came to Edward with a laptop. I've done everything, he said. Now let's see if she's hiding anything. We'll do this together. Are you okay with that? Yeah. I suggested it myself, mumbled Edward. I still hope we are wrong about Mom. And she has nothing to hide, maybe. Let's hope. Patrick shrugged. At first, the apartment on the screen was empty. But then Lucille returned home. First thing, she headed to the bathroom, where there were no cameras. When she came out, she looked like a completely different person. The dark circles under her eyes vanished, and her face looked altogether different. She slumped into the chair, crossing her legs on the coffee table. Lucille moved differently while in her son's apartment. Patrick muttered in amazement, "Your mother doesn't seem sick at all." And her face, it can't be. I've seen all the medical reports, tests, chemotherapy with my own eyes. Edward replied, "Chemotherapy?" Patrick leaned closer to the screen. "Look closely. Your mother took off her scarf. She has hair growing on her head. Does it look like that after chemotherapy?" Shocked, Edward remained silent. He himself saw that his mother seemed to have been replaced on the screen. She looked and behaved completely differently. Not like when she was with him. Could it be that even her illness was a charade? Then, Lucille's phone rang in her purse. She jumped up abruptly and answered the call. "Why are you calling?" "If I'm not picking up, it means I can't answer. So I'll call you back." Lucille yelled into the phone. "What's happening at the hospital? Did you find out? Can you do something about it?" "What? Near my building? I told you not to come to my house. I said we'd only meet on neutral ground." "Okay, Edward shouldn't come over now. Go up, but just for a short while." "Yes, you're right," Lucille said. "What if we start a fire? Renee, she can't work right now. She won't be able to get out and will suffocate. Maybe we should try that." "What? Are you serious? There are many people like Renee lying there. There could be many casualties." "So what? Since when did you start caring about that?" "As far as I remember, you never bothered with moral aspects. Let it be as it will be. The main thing is that Renee doesn't get out." "No, absolutely not," George said firmly. "I didn't agree to that. I won't do it." "Lord, then think. Find another option. But faster. We need to get this done in the next few days while she's weak. That's it. Go. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I'll think about it too. I'll call you when something comes to mind." Edward no longer looked at the screen, unable to bear his mother's malicious expression. He sat beside the laptop, simply listening. Understanding that the conversation between Lucille and George was over, he lifted his head and abruptly closed the laptop. "That's enough. We've heard enough. I can't take it anymore." Patrick waited for a pause, giving his friend a moment to collect himself. Only then did he ask, "What are we going to do? How will we deal with this recording? You understand how it should be handled. You just want to hear it from me." "Yes, we'll take it to the police." "Do you realize your mother will go to jail?" "She said a lot. She'll definitely go to jail." "I understand, but that's where she belongs. She should have been there a long time ago, after the incident with Renee's father. And now, at least, let justice catch up with her." Patrick approached Renee's apartment door and rang the bell. It was opened by the housekeeper and Linda's nanny. After being discharged from the hospital, Renee had to rely on her services because it was difficult to manage household chores and take care of her daughter while in a wheelchair. Renee quickly wheeled herself out of the bedroom on her wheelchair. So, she impatiently asked her friend, "What's the verdict?" Today was the final court hearing where Lucille was supposed to be sentenced. Patrick attended alone, without Renee. As much as she wanted to be there in person and relish Lucille's suffering, she didn't go, not wanting her mother-in-law to see her in a wheelchair. Renee didn't want to give the defendant even the slightest joy of knowing she had caused any harm to her daughter-in-law. "Will you tell me or not? How many years did they give Lucille?" 12 years. Patrick replied. "That seems too little." Lucille didn't think so. "You should have seen her crying in the courtroom." "It's a pity I didn't see that. But never mind. When I get up from this chair, and I will, I'll visit her in prison. healthy and happy. I have no doubt you'll get up from that chair. But why would you want to visit Lucille in prison? She got what she deserved. Forget about her and live your life. Do you feel sorry for her? Renee asked. No, not for her. I feel sorry for you. Your hatred is eating you up inside. You've already lost your husband because of it. Isn't that enough? I didn't lose my husband. The girl objected. He didn't leave forever. You know, Edward said he needs a change of scenery to calm down. He didn't want to be in town while his mother was on trial. Yes, Renee, that's true. But he left not because of his mother, but because of you. After the hospital, you became unbearable. Your hatred towards Lucille was overwhelming, and that drove your husband away from you. He himself took the recording of his mother's confession to the police, though it wasn't easy for him. But you, Renee, I beg you, calm down. Your anger will ruin your life. Let go of the situation. I know, I'm trying. You're right, as always. I won't go to visit Lucille in prison. I'll live for my daughter. I'll wait for Edward to come back. In reality, Patrick had serious doubts that Edward would return to Renee. After the hospital, the girl's anger started to resemble Lucille's own, and it was difficult for Edward to handle. He left for nowhere, to a strange city. Edward left with a wounded soul and was unlikely to want to come back. Patrick asked, "Is Edward calling you?" "He is, but very rarely. Mostly asking about our daughter. He says he's found a job. Everything's fine with him. When I ask him about coming back home, he says he's not ready yet." Will he ever be ready? After his friend left, Renee wheeled herself to the mirror and looked closely at her reflection. Here she was, a strong woman. So why was it like this? Why wasn't her husband by her side? And why was she sitting in a wheelchair? "It's okay. It's okay," Renee murmured to herself. "I will stand up. I will definitely stand up. It's just a matter of time. I'll let go of the situation. As Patrick advises, I'll become a normal person. Forget about Lucille. And I'll bring Edward back. I will definitely